close your eyes, if you haven't already, and let the world you know grow soft and distant around you. Because tonight we are going somewhere very old, somewhere that smells of wood smoke and olive oil and warm stone, somewhere that has been waiting quietly for you to arrive. And if you find on other nights when sleep feels far away, that you would like to return to stories like this one, unhurried stories told in the dark, there is a small and easy thing you can do, which is to subscribe, so that these voices are always there when you need them, waiting like a lamp left burning in a window. And if you feel moved to leave a word in the comments tonight, perhaps just the name of the place where you are lying down to rest, that would be a gentle and lovely thing, because there are people listening to this very story from all across the world this evening, in cities and villages and quiet rooms. And there is something rather beautiful about that, about this scattered, sleepless, wandering community finding one another in the dark. But now, come with me. It is somewhere near the middle of the 1st century before the birth of Christ, and the city of Rome breathes in a way that only very old cities breathe, with a kind of deep and layered exhalation that carries within it the smell of 1,000 years of living. The sun has been up for some hours already. The light falls at an angle across the terracotta rooftops of the Aventine Hill, and somewhere below in the long shadowed valleys between those hills that the Romans have always called home, the city is doing what it does every morning. It is waking and complaining and beginning again. There is the sound of a cart on stone, the heavy wooden wheels grinding over the ancient paving blocks of the Via Sacra, the driver half asleep and swaying on his seat, while the mule plods forward with the patient indifference of a creature that has made this journey 10,000 times. Carts were not permitted in the city during the daylight hours. The streets were too narrow, too crowded, too full of human argument, and so the deliveries happened in the dark, or at first light, and now as the cart finally rattles free of the city's throat, the driver exhales and the mule flicks an ear, and the sound fades into the morning. In the forums and covered markets, the stalls are being arranged. A woman lays out dried figs on a cloth the color of old rust. A man stacks amphoras of Spanish olive oil against a wall, each one taller than a child and sealed with wax and pitch, the clay faintly warm from the sun that has already been climbing for some time. There are cheeses wrapped in leaves, and cuts of pork hung from iron hooks, and baskets of lentils and barley and emmer wheat, and the smell of it all together, ripe and animal and slightly fermented, and dusted with the particular sweetness of dried herbs, is the smell of the Roman morning, inseparable from the sound of voices arguing in Latin and Oscan and Greek and half a dozen other languages that the Republic has absorbed into itself like a sponge. Because Rome in this century is already something vast. It is not yet the empire that it will become. That particular transformation is still being prepared in the wings of history, but it has already swallowed the world it knew. To the west, the long peninsula of Spain has been Roman for 100 years. To the south, the great rival Carthage was reduced to ashes 2 generations ago, and the rich provinces of Africa now send their grain across the sea in a steady and reliable tide. To the east, the old kingdoms of Greece and Macedonia have bent their necks and accepted the toga, and Roman governors sit in the marble halls of cities that were ancient when Rome was still a village on a hill beside a river. And yet the Republic is not entirely comfortable in its greatness. There is a quality to this century, a particular kind of restlessness, like a fire that has grown too large for the hearth that was built to contain it. The old institutions, the Senate, the consulship, the careful annual rotation of power, the long tradition of no one man holding too much authority for too long, these things were built for a city-state, for a community of farmers and soldiers who lived close enough to the forum to walk there and cast their votes in person. They were not designed for an entity that stretches from the Pillars of Hercules to the borders of Syria, that governs tens of millions of people, that requires armies to be in the field for years at a time under commanders who inevitably grow powerful and distant and difficult to recall. The Senate meets in a long colonnaded building near the heart of the forum, and on any given morning you might find several hundred men of the senatorial class arranging themselves on their benches in the way that men of importance always arrange themselves, which is to say with great attention to who is sitting near whom and what that implies. The senators wear the toga with its broad purple stripe, the latest clavis, and they speak in the formal registers of Latin that have been trained into them since boyhood, the rhythms of Cicero and Cato, and the older orators whose words they memorized before they were old enough to shave. The debates can last all day. They can be brilliant. They can be tedious beyond all endurance. They can be, on certain afternoons when something important is at stake, genuinely frightening in the way that power is always frightening when it is openly contested. But step away from the forum. Walk a little into the quieter streets away from the merchants and the senators and the professional arguers of every stripe, and you will find the Rome that most people actually inhabit. The insulae, the great apartment blocks that rise 4 and 5 stories above the narrow lanes, lean slightly toward each other overhead, and from their windows comes the smell of cooking, of onions softened in fat, of bread baked on hearthstones, of the particular warm, dusty smell of families living in close quarters through the long Mediterranean summer. Children play in the spaces between buildings. A man sits in a doorway repairing a sandal, moving his needle slowly through thick leather, his lips moving slightly as he works through some private calculation or prayer. In the evenings, which are where we find our truest sense of this world, Rome changes its character entirely. The harsh light softens into something amber, and then rose, and then a deep and quiet blue, and the fires begin to be lit, not just in the hearths of kitchens and the braziers of wealthy houses, but in the small clay lamps, the lucernae, that burn olive oil and cast their modest pools of warmth across tabletops and sleeping faces and the carved stone of household shrines. Every household has its shrine, its little shelf or niche where the lares and penates, the spirits of home and larder, are given their daily acknowledgement. A pinch of incense, a few drops of wine, a moment of attention from someone pausing in the middle of the evening's work to remember that the house itself is sacred, that the fire that burns in it is an ancient and living thing. The Romans are deeply, practically, almost casually religious, in the way of people for whom the gods are not remote and theoretical, but immediate and concerned. There are gods for the threshold, and gods for the hearth, and gods for the city gates, and gods for the moment of planting, and gods for the moment of harvest. The great gods, Jupiter and Juno and Minerva enthroned on the Capitol, preside over the public life of the Republic, and their priests in their white robes process through the forum on festival days, and the augurs watch the flight of birds and read the entrails of animals, and the business of government pauses when the omens are unfavorable, because the Romans understand that there are forces larger than ambition, larger than the Senate, larger than any single man. This is the world into which a child will soon be born, in the green hills northeast of Rome, in a region called Picenum, where the land is fertile, and the families are old, and the men have been giving their sons to the legions for generations. He will be born into a military household, into a father's ambition, and a province's loyalty, and the particular kind of character that forms in a boy who grows up hearing Latin spoken with the accent of command. He will grow into a man whose name will be spoken in every corner of this already enormous world, and then spoken again, more quietly, after everything is changed. But that is for another night, another unhurried telling. For now the lamps of Rome burn low across the city's 7 hills, and the last carts have long since ceased their grinding, and the forum is empty in the dark, and the olive oil gutters in its little clay cups, sending thin threads of smoke upward into the still night air, wavering once and then going still. The hills of Picenum catch the light differently from the hills of Rome, and if you have never stood among them in the early morning, it is worth a moment to let the mind travel there now, to follow the slow drift of mist rising off the Adriatic coastal plain as the sun comes up behind you and turns the ridgelines gold, the whole landscape breathing in and out with the quiet patience of a place that has been old for a very long time. This is where Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus began, though he was not yet Magnus, not yet great, not yet anything except a boy in a large house on a prosperous estate, running barefoot over ground his family had worked for generations. The year of his birth, so far as the old sources agree, was 106 years before the birth of Christ, in the month of September, in a season when the harvest was already underway in the lower fields, and the smell of crushed grain hung in the air over the farmsteads like a blessing. He came into the world, as nearly all people do, without any announcement from the world itself, though the story goes, as it always goes with men who become famous, that those who knew his father understood from the very beginning that this particular son was different in some quality that was difficult to name. His father was Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, and Strabo was not a man to inspire warm feeling, though he inspired a great deal else. He was wealthy by any standard the Republic recognized, holding vast tracts of land across the Picenum region, the area that stretches between the Apennine spine of Italy and the Adriatic coast. Fertile country, sheep country, grain country, the kind of land that produces not only crops, but the kind of men who know how to manage and command large things. Strabo was one of those men. He was also a soldier of considerable reputation and a politician of the darker sort, a man who understood that power in Rome required not only connections in the city, but the willingness to hold a sword when the moment demanded it, and the wisdom to know exactly which moment that was. For young Pompey, growing up in this household meant growing up inside a particular kind of order, a military order that extended itself into everything, into the way meals were taken, into the arrangement of the household staff, into the rhythms of the day which rose and fell, not around the soft domestic timetables of the Roman senatorial class, but around the harder, more practical hours of a man who kept his legions close, even when there was technically no war to fight. There would always, it seemed to those who lived near Strabo, be the suggestion of legions nearby, whether they were actually in the fields beyond the estate's boundaries, or simply in the quality of the man's attention, in the way he moved through rooms, as though he was perpetually reviewing them. The boy who would become Pompey the Great grew up watching all of this, and it is not difficult to imagine, in the way that sleep invites us to imagine, rather than to reason strictly, what those early years might have felt like from the inside. Picenum was not Rome. It was quieter, greener, more self-contained, a world where the seasons mattered more than the political calendar of the city, where the quality of the olive harvest, where the health of the sheep flocks had direct consequences that everyone on the estate could feel. Pompey would have known this land intimately, in the way that only children know places, through the particular slope of a familiar hill, the sound of a stream at different times of year, the smell of the air when rain was coming in off the Adriatic, that distinctive softness that arrives a little before the drops themselves. He had, it is said, an exceptional physical quality even in boyhood, a quality not precisely of strength but of presence, of something in his bearing that drew the eye without demanding it. The ancient sources, who are always somewhat too eager to find in a man's childhood the seeds of his later greatness, describe a handsomeness that was open rather than sharp, a face that people found themselves trusting, and eyes that were said to carry a kind of warmth that was genuine enough to be disarming. Whether all of this was truly visible in the child, or whether it has been laid over him retrospectively by admirers writing long after his death, it is impossible now to say with certainty. But there is something consistent enough in the accounts that it seems reasonable to allow the image to settle. A boy of unusual natural grace, moving through a household built on discipline and calculation, absorbing both, without being hardened entirely by either. His education would have followed the pattern expected of a family at this level of Roman society. Greek letters, Latin rhetoric, some philosophy, the kinds of learning that prepared a young man to speak well in public, and to think clearly enough under pressure that he did not embarrass his family. Strabo was not a man much given to philosophy himself, but he understood that a son who could argue a case in the forum was a more useful instrument than one who could only carry a sword. The schools of the great cities were not immediately available in Picenum, but tutors could be brought, and were brought, and Pompey would have sat at his lessons in some comfortable room of the estate house, with the sounds of the working farm coming in through the open windows, the low murmur of cattle being moved, the distant voices of men in the fields, the creak and splash of water being drawn from wells. It was water that marked the rhythms of this landscape most insistently, the way it marks all landscapes that sit between mountains and sea. The rivers of Picenum ran down from the Apennines toward the Adriatic with a freshness that the city rivers of Rome, the Tiber running slow and thick with the business of a million lives, could not quite equal. Pompey grew up with the sound of clean water nearby, with the smell of it in spring when the snowmelt came down from the high ground, and the streams ran full and cold and fast over their stony beds. It is one of those small biographical details that leaves no trace in the ancient sources, because no one thought to write it down. and yet it shapes a person in ways that are real even when they are invisible. The particular ease with which a person carries themselves in open country, the patience that comes from having grown up somewhere that changes with the seasons, rather than remaining always artificially the same. Strabo, for all his roughness of character, appears to have taken his eldest son's formation seriously, and there are suggestions in the later record that Pompey was brought into his father's confidence earlier than most boys of his age would have been allowed into the affairs of a man of power. Not that Strabo explained himself or reasoned with the boy in any tender modern sense. The relationship between Roman fathers and sons was governed by a formality that modern listeners might find somewhat chilly, the father holding legal authority over the son that was essentially absolute. The son expected to honor and obey rather than to question or to negotiate. But within that formal structure, Strabo seems to have recognized something in Pompey that was worth cultivating deliberately, some quality of attention or of judgment that made it worth bringing the boy along to see things that other boys were left at home to miss. And so Pompey watched. He watched the way his father dealt with clients who came to the estate seeking favor, the careful balance of generosity and condescension that kept men loyal without allowing them to feel they were equals. He watched the way Strabo moved among his soldiers when the troops were mustered on the estate grounds, the particular quality of authority that did not need to shout because it was so completely certain of itself. He watched the political visitors who came from Rome or from the other great Picenum families, and he began, without being taught directly, to read the registers of meaning that ran underneath the formal courtesies of Roman social exchange. All of this would come to matter enormously in the years that were not yet visible from those quiet Picenum mornings. The war that would define his father's legacy and shape the young Pompey's first real encounter with violence was still gathering itself somewhere just beyond the horizon of these childhood years, moving toward them with the slow inevitability of a summer storm building over the Apennines, not yet here but coming, and changing the quality of the light in ways that a careful watcher could already begin to detect. For now, though, the morning mist still rises off the coastal plain, the fields beyond the estate still hold the long gold light of a September afternoon, and somewhere in the house, a boy who does not yet know his own name as history will know it, is learning simply by being present the first patient lessons of a remarkable life. Let that image rest with you now, soft and unhurried, as the evening deepens into night and sleep begins to draw close, carrying you gently toward whatever comes next. The hills of Picenum are just beginning to release the warmth they have held all day, and somewhere in the middle distance, beyond the rows of tents and the low fires already being coaxed into life, a trumpet sounds the first watch. It is a sound that carries differently in the open countryside than it does in the city. Out here it does not bounce between stone walls and terracotta rooftops, but simply rises, spreads, and dissolves into the cooling air like smoke, like breath, like everything that ends gently rather than all at once. And it is into this sound, this particular quality of late afternoon dissolving into evening on a military campaign, that we follow the young Gnaeus Pompeius, still a teenager in the early years of the 8th decade before the birth of Christ, riding close enough to his father's retinue to learn everything, and far enough away to seem as though he is simply there, simply present, the way young men of a certain talent manage to be present in exactly the right places. He was perhaps 17 years old when the social war began, that conflict whose name sounds almost gentle to a modern ear, as though it were a war fought over manners or conversation, but whose Latin root tells a different story, the word socii, meaning allies, and the war being precisely the violent rupture of an alliance long overdue for renegotiation. The Italian peoples who had fought beside Rome for generations, who had bled in her armies and died in her campaigns from Spain to Macedonia, had grown weary of contributing everything to Roman power while receiving none of its formal privileges, none of the protections and rights that came with Roman citizenship. And so they rose, in the year that would later be counted as 91 before the birth of Christ, in a coordinated uprising that shocked Rome with its organization, its fury, and its scale. This was not a slave rebellion or a barbarian raid. This was Rome's own mirror, turned to face her, and the reflection was uncomfortable. Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, Pompey's father, was one of Rome's senior commanders in the north, and it is said he was not a man who inspired warmth. The ancient sources describe him as capable and cold, shrewd in the way of men who have learned to measure everything: loyalty, affection, time itself, as a general measures supplies, useful in proportion, dangerous in excess. He was effective, which in war often matters more than being loved. And the campaigns he directed in the northern theater of the social war were prosecuted with the kind of grinding efficiency that wears an enemy down without ever quite admitting it is doing so. He did not win in sudden brilliant strokes. He won the way weather wins, steadily, persistently, until resistance simply becomes impractical. And it was at this man's side, or rather just behind this man's shoulder, that young Pompey spent his first real education in the art of war. Not the theoretical war of tutors and scrolls, though he had that too. The rhythms of Greek military thought, the campaigns of Alexander described in careful prose, the siege techniques catalogued by careful scholars in distant libraries. No, this was the war of mud and arithmetic, of counting how many days of grain remained in the wagons, of watching a subordinate's face when orders were given to see whether obedience was real or merely performed. This was the war of listening at the edges of command councils, absorbing not just the decisions being made, but the texture of how decisions were made. When to push, when to wait, when a man who seemed about to yield needed only one more hour to collapse entirely. The soldiers themselves were his teachers too, in their way. It is said, and this detail has the particular warmth of things that feel true, even when they cannot be verified, that Pompey made a habit of walking among the ordinary legionaries, eating with them, sharing the same rough bread and the same thin morning fire, learning their names with the kind of attention that men who live difficult lives find unexpectedly moving when someone in authority bothers to demonstrate it. Whether this was instinct or calculation hardly matters. The effect was the same. The soldiers of his father's army came, over the months of that campaign, to regard the general's young son not as an ornament or a liability, but as something rarer and more valuable, a future commander in whom they could already see the shape of a man worth following. The fires in the camp at night were where he learned perhaps the most. The evening fire is a particular institution in any army in any age, a place where the hierarchies of daylight soften slightly, where stories are told that would not survive the formality of day, where men speak about fear without quite using the word, where experienced soldiers teach younger ones the things that no manual records because they are too human, too fragile, too dependent on the specific feeling of a specific night to be written down. What it sounds like when a large body of enemy troops is moving in darkness. How to read the quality of a silence that precedes an attack. Why certain kinds of cold make horses unreliable, even when they seem calm. The fires burned low toward the middle of the night, and the talk grew slower, and the young Pompey sat in that warmth and listened, and whatever he was becoming began, in those hours, to take its shape. The social war itself resolved, as many Roman conflicts of this period resolved, through a combination of military pressure and political concession. The citizenship that Rome had refused to grant before the war was in stages, extended to those who laid down their arms, and then more broadly still, until the definition of what it meant to be Roman had quietly expanded to include most of the Italian peninsula. It was not a clean resolution. Wars rarely end cleanly. They trail off, they leave pockets of bitterness and exhausted grief in towns that lost too many men, in families that had been on opposing sides of a line they had not drawn themselves. But the main conflict wound down, and Strabo's campaigns in the north concluded with a Roman victory, and the legions began the familiar labor of moving from a war footing back towards something resembling ordinary life. What Pompey carried away from those years was not glory, not yet, not in any formal sense. He had no command of his own, no office, no laurel crown waiting for him in Rome. What he carried was something less visible and far more durable, a practiced eye for the human terrain of an army. He understood now that an army is not primarily a military instrument. It is a community of men who have agreed, under varying degrees of coercion and persuasion, to do difficult things together, and that the quality of a general is measured not only by his strategic intelligence, but by his ability to sustain that agreement through cold and shortage and fear and the long grinding tedium of campaigns that do not resolve in a single clean afternoon. He had learned to read men the way his father read maps, noting where the strength lay, where the weakness might give way under pressure, where a careful investment of attention now would pay dividends in loyalty later. And there was something else he had learned, though it would be years before he could have named it, that power, real power, is built slowly and quietly in the space between formal appointments. His father held a command because Rome had given it to him. But the soldiers who would follow Pompey through the rest of his life would do so because of something that had begun accumulating in those evenings around the low fires of a campaign in northeastern Italy, in the steady warmth of a young man who paid attention, who remembered names, who knew how bread tasted when it was 3 days old and a long march from any town. The fires of that first campaign would cool and be left behind, but their warmth had already done its work. It had begun to form the man. And as we let those fires settle into embers now, as the first watch gives way to the deep stillness of a camp in the middle hours, we might rest in the knowledge that the next layer of this story is already waiting for us, unhurried and quiet, in the streets and kitchens and forums of Rome herself, where ordinary life continued its ancient rhythms, even as the world outside its walls slowly changed. There is time enough for that, for now the embers are warm, and the night air is still, and you have learned what a general's son can learn when he is paying attention. Let that be enough for tonight. Let it carry you gently into sleep. The city breathes before it wakes, long before the sun has cleared the ridge of the Esquiline Hill, before the first shaft of proper daylight has found its way down between the crowded insulae and the temple colonnades. Rome is already stirring in the dark, and you can hear it if you are still enough, if your own breathing has grown slow and your eyes have softened against the pillow. There is the low creak of a cartwheel on stone, the particular grinding complaint of an axle bearing weight that would not be permitted once daylight came, for the laws of the city forbade wheeled traffic in the daytime hours, and so the merchants and the haulers did their moving in the velvet hours before dawn, filling the narrow streets with their noise, while the rest of the world still slept. You might hear a mule snort somewhere below a shuttered window. You might hear the distant clatter of amphorae being unloaded at a warehouse near the Tiber, the clay vessels knocking softly against one another, each one sealed with its plug of resin or wax, each one carrying oil or wine or fish sauce from somewhere far away, from the olive groves of Spain or the vineyards of the Greek islands, or the salting houses along the North African coast. This is the city as it always was, long before Pompey grew to manhood, and as it would remain long after. Rome in the first century before the birth of Christ is a thing of layered textures, impossible to hold all at once, impossible to reduce to any single image, because it is all images at the same time, all smells, all sounds, all temperatures pressing against the skin simultaneously. The city holds perhaps something close to 1 million souls, it is believed, but the counting of such things was always uncertain, always approximate, a matter of informed guessing rather than true knowledge. What is certain is the density of it, the sheer closeness of human life pressing against human life in every direction. By the time the light is fully established, the streets have already shifted character entirely, the carts have retreated, the streets belong now to feet, to sandaled feet and bare feet, and the heavy-soled boots of soldiers passing through, to the soft slap of a senator's attendants clearing a path ahead of their master's litter, to the patter of children sent on errands, to the measured, unhurried step of a priest in his toga, making his way toward the morning's ritual obligations. The smells shift too with the hour. Early morning brings the cold stone smell of the streets themselves, that particular mineral coolness of ancient paving that has been once smoothed by generations of passage. Then comes the smell of bread. The bakeries open early, and there were many of them clustered near the insulae, where most of the city's population lived, in rented rooms stacked several stories high. The bread was round and scored across the top, baked in clay ovens that had been heating since before first light, and the smell of it moved through the streets like something almost alive, warm and yeasty and deeply reassuring. Not everyone had the means or the space to cook for themselves, and so the streets of Rome were full of what we might now call food stalls, counters built of stone, with circular holes cut into the surface to receive large clay pots of food, kept warm from below. You could stop there in the morning and take a bowl of something hot, a porridge of emmer wheat, or a thick soup of beans and herbs, or a mess of yesterday's vegetables, cooked soft in olive oil, with a little garum stirred through for depth. Garum was the fermented fish sauce that the Romans put on almost everything. A deeply savory, intensely pungent condiment made by layering fish and salt in great clay vessels and leaving them to ripen in the sun for weeks or months. To modern nostrils, it might seem overwhelming. To the Roman palate, it was simply the background note of almost all food. The taste that lay beneath everything else, the way the smell of the Tiber lay beneath all the other smells of the city. Always present, always quietly there. The Forum was the heart of public life, and the Roman Forum in these years was already ancient, already layered with centuries of significance. It was not a quiet or contemplative place in the daytime hours. It was dense with people and purpose. Merchants set up near the edges of the space, selling everything from lengths of cloth to small terracotta figurines of gods and household spirits. Lawyers gathered near the rostra, the great stone platform from which public speeches were given, its front face decorated with the bronze rams of captured enemy ships. The rostra, the beaks, they called it, and around these lawyers clustered their clients, men seeking advice or advocacy, or simply the reassurance of expertise. Slaves moved through the crowds on their master's business, recognizable sometimes only by the absence of the toga, which was the garment of the free Roman citizen, that heavy woolen wrap that required practice and patience to put on correctly, and that sagged and shifted through the day's business, until by evening it hung rather less magnificently than it had at dawn. The afternoon brought a different rhythm. The heat of the Italian summer pressed down on the stone and the brick, and radiated back upward, and the sensible Roman withdrew from it, retreating to the relative shade of a portico, or the dimness of a room with thick walls. The insulae had no glass in their windows, only wooden shutters, and through those open shutters in summer came both the occasional merciful breeze and the constant noise of the street below. The wealthy, of course, had other options. The sprawling private houses with their central courtyards open to the sky, their impluvium pools catching rainwater and reflecting it in shifting pale rectangles across the ceiling, their garden rooms fragrant with herbs and cut flowers, their tessellated floors cool underfoot. These houses were not entirely private in the modern sense. The morning salutatio was a ritual obligation. The great man received his clients, his friends, his dependents, in the atrium of his house each morning, and the clients came with requests, and the patron received them with varying degrees of warmth and attention, and this exchange of obligation and favor was the quiet engine that drove so much of Roman social life. Evening was the time of the evening meal, the cena, the event around which the social day truly organized itself for those who could afford to make it an event at all. In a prosperous household, this was a long and leisurely affair, conducted on cushioned dining couches arranged in the traditional three-sided formation around a low central table, the diners reclining on their left sides in the Greek fashion, sharing food from common dishes that moved around the table in a loosely ordered sequence, eggs and olives and small salted fish to begin, then the main dishes of roasted meat, or baked fish or spice stews fragrant with cumin and coriander and pepper, brought at great expense from the Far East, and then something sweet at the end, honeyed pastries or fresh fruit, or preserved dates. Wine was mixed with water throughout. To drink it unmixed was considered a mark of barbarism. And the mixing vessel, the crater, sat somewhere central and was attended to throughout the meal. And then there was fire. In every house, in every room, in every corner of the city as the evening deepened, there was fire. The oil lamps were small things, most of them, made of clay or occasionally bronze, shaped to hold a small pool of oil with a wick of twisted flax emerging from the spout, and their light was warm and unsteady, throwing soft orange shadows up the walls and across the faces of the people gathered around them. A single lamp gave less light than you might expect. A room would hold several, placed on stands or hung from ceiling chains, or set into niches in the wall, and their combined glow was enough to eat by, to read by if your eyes were young and the text was not too small, to talk by, which was perhaps their most important service. In that gentle, unsteady warmth, conversation stretched and wandered. Wine was poured again. Someone might read aloud from a scroll, a poem, a letter, a section of history. The fire in the small brazier in the corner breathed softly, its coals shifting and settling, sending up a thin thread of fragrant smoke. This is the world through which a young man of Pompey's ambitions and circumstances would have moved. Not yet the commanding general, not yet the celebrated conqueror of pirates and kings, but a young man still in the process of becoming, still learning what Rome asked of those who wished to matter within its ancient, elaborate, fire-warmed life. And soon, very soon, the choices that would define him would begin to arrive, urgent, consequential, and impossible to avoid. For now, though, the lamps burn low, and the city rests, and somewhere in the warm darkness a single flame bends gently in a current of air. The road from Picenum runs southward through country that changes slowly, the hills losing their softness by degrees as the land opens into wider valleys and the light takes on the harder quality of central Italy, where the sky seems somehow larger and the shadows fall more deliberately across the earth. It was along roads like these, or roads very much like them, that a young man of perhaps 20 years sat with his thoughts in the autumn of a world coming apart at its seams, and tried to decide what kind of man he intended to become. Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo was dead. The fever had taken him with the abruptness that fevers sometimes choose, leaving behind not grief so much as a sudden and vertiginous absence, the way a stone is pulled from a wall, and the wall stands for a moment before you notice the gap. The elder Pompey had been a complicated figure, feared more than loved, admired more than trusted, and his son had grown up in that complicated shadow, learning from it what he could, and quietly noting what he wished to avoid. But now the shadow was gone, and the young man who remained was something remarkable and somewhat dangerous. He was wealthy beyond the measure of most Roman families. He had ridden through a war at his father's side. He understood the legions from the inside, and he was entirely, utterly free. The estates in Picenum were substantial. The word substantial does not quite carry the weight it should. The Pompey family held land across the northeastern countryside in such quantity that the local people knew them not merely as landlords, but as something closer to the earth itself, as permanent a feature of the landscape as the rivers and the hills. The tenant farmers who worked these lands had known the elder Strabo, had fought for him when he asked, had feared his temper, and respected his competence, and now they looked at his son with a particular kind of watchful attention, the attention of people who understand that power has shifted, but have not yet decided what the shift means for them. Pompey understood this. He was young, but he understood it with a clarity that surprised even those closest to him. And so in those first months after his father's death, as Rome itself shuddered through its own crisis, the city pulled between the forces of Sulla the general and Cinna the consul, between those who had marched with the armies and those who controlled the capital. Pompey walked his own land and spoke quietly with his people and turned over in his mind a question that would define the rest of his life. The city was not safe. This much was clear to anyone who paid attention. The stories arriving from Rome were the kind of stories that make a careful person go still. Names of the proscribed read out in public, property seized, men killed in the street, for political associations that might have seemed harmless a season earlier. Cinna held Rome, and Cinna's Rome was a city of sudden reversals and uncertain futures, where loyalty to the wrong general could undo a family in an afternoon. Pompey had already experienced something of this. There is a story, told with some variation across the ancient sources, that he had been accused of certain improprieties related to his father's campaign spoils, and that he had navigated this with a combination of legal skill and personal charm that left him free and rather more famous than before. He had learned, in other words, that reputation was a resource like any other, and that it could be spent or saved or invested, depending on one's judgment of the moment. Sulla was somewhere in the south. Sulla was always somewhere dramatic. The man seemed to generate legend the way a fire generates heat, as an unavoidable byproduct of simply existing. He had marched on Rome once already, a thing so extraordinary that most Romans still spoke of it, in the lowered voice one uses for events that have no precedent, events for which the language has not quite prepared itself. He was marching again now, returning from the east with his legions and his terrible discipline and his absolute certainty that Rome had wronged him and that he intended to correct this. His enemies called this treason. His supporters called it restoration. Most people simply tried to stay out of the way. And Pompey chose. The choosing was not a single moment, of course. These things rarely are, whatever the storytellers prefer. It was a season of choosing, a slow accumulation of conversations and calculations, and quiet walks through the Pekin countryside in the long light of late afternoon, when the fields take on their golden exhausted beauty, and the smoke from the farmhouses drifts almost without moving in the still air. He spoke with his father's old veterans. He examined his own resources with the thoroughness of someone who has recently discovered that resources are finite and circumstances are not. He thought about what Rome was and what it might become, and where a young man of exceptional ability but no official standing might find his footing in either version. The decision, when it fully arrived, was characteristically bold. He would not simply join Sulla. He would not arrive as a supplicant or an ally seeking favor. He would raise his own legions from his own estates, and he would come to Sulla as a general in his own right, with soldiers at his back and a claim to be taken seriously before a single word was exchanged. What followed was extraordinary by any measure. The men of Picenum responded to Pompey with an enthusiasm that the ancient sources describe in terms suggesting something almost beyond ordinary recruitment. It is said that his father's name, and more than his father's name, that something in Pompey himself, some quality of presence and confidence, and the impression he gave of knowing precisely what he intended to do, drew veterans and farmhands and the sons of tenant families together into something that began to look, with a speed that astonished observers, like actual military units. He organized them with the knowledge he had absorbed riding through the social war, assigning officers with care, establishing the supply arrangements that any experienced soldier knows matter more than courage in the long run, moving with an energy that seemed inexhaustible and a patience with detail that belied his years. 3 legions. He raised 3 legions. The number should settle in the mind for a moment, because it represents not merely an organizational achievement, but a statement of intent so large it could not be misread. A single legion was a significant thing, the kind of force that commanded attention and respect. 3 legions, assembled from private resources by a man who held no public office and had never been elected to anything, was something else entirely. It was the declaration of a new kind of actor in Roman politics, someone who operated outside the traditional structures, not out of ignorance of those structures, but out of a considered judgment that they were, for the moment, insufficient. He marched south through Italy with his 3 legions, and the march itself was not without difficulty. There were forces loyal to the Cinnan government in the region, and there were moments of real danger, skirmishes and ambushes, and situations requiring quick thinking and steady nerve. The ancient writers who describe these encounters tend to note a certain quality in him during these episodes. A coolness under pressure, combined with a willingness to be where the danger was, to ride to the threatened point himself, rather than receiving reports from a distance. His soldiers noticed this. Soldiers always notice this. And then, somewhere in the landscape of southern Italy, he came to Sulla. The meeting between them has been described in a way that has the quality of a story polished by many retellings, smooth to a kind of emblematic simplicity. Sulla, surrounded by his senior officers and his considerable dignity, greeted the young man from Picenum, this 23-year-old who had materialized from the north with 3 legions at his back, and is said to have saluted him as Magnus, as the Great One. Whether this happened precisely as described and in precisely that moment, the historians have debated with their customary thoroughness. But something like it happened, or was understood to have happened, because from this point in the story the name begins to attach itself to him in the way that names sometimes do, settling quietly into place like a key into a lock. And Gnaeus Pompeius gradually becomes Pompeius Magnus in the imagination of his world. He had chosen. The choosing had cost him nothing yet, and had given him everything he had calculated it would give him. A powerful patron who needed him, an army that was his own, and a name that was beginning to grow larger than the young man who carried it. In the camps that night, wherever those camps were pitched across the autumn countryside of Italy, the fires would have burned low in the hours before sleep, and the smoke would have drifted upward through the cooling air, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and leather and cooked grain, the smell of an army at rest, and somewhere in one of those circles of firelight, a young man of 23 sat with the full weight of his choice resting quietly on his shoulders, which were by all accounts broad enough to bear it. Tomorrow would bring the next thing, but for now there was only the fire and the dark and the slow breathing of sleeping soldiers all around. The ships are moving out of Ostia harbor in the gray light before dawn, their oars cutting the water in long, slow strokes, and the sound carries across the surface of the sea like a whisper that cannot quite decide whether it is a farewell or a beginning. The air smells of salt and pine tar, and the particular cold dampness that settles over the Tyrrhenian in the weeks before winter loosens its hold, and if you were standing on the dockside watching those vessels grow smaller against the pale horizon, you might have noticed that the man commanding them was still very young, younger certainly than the gravity of his task seemed to require. He was perhaps 23 years of age, or near enough that the difference hardly mattered, and yet he carried aboard those ships not only soldiers and provisions and the iron instruments of Roman military authority, but something harder to name, a quality of absolute certainty, a composure that neither boasted nor apologized, that simply settled around him like a cloak and made the men who served him feel, almost despite themselves, that they were going somewhere worth going. The commission that Sulla had given him was not a small thing, even by the standards of a moment when nothing felt small. Sicily had slipped away from the Sullan cause, drawn toward the Marian remnants that still clung to power in various corners of the Roman world, and the island mattered enormously. It mattered as a source of grain, as a naval station, as a symbol of what the restored Senate's authority could or could not hold. The proconsul Perperna was there, and with him a collection of officers and soldiers who had made the wrong choice, or what Sulla had decided was the wrong choice, and Pompey had been sent to set the island right. He set it right very quickly. The story goes that Perperna, upon hearing of Pompey's arrival with a substantial and well-supplied army, did not fight at all, that the mere news of who was coming was sufficient to dissolve whatever resolution he had managed to maintain, and that he handed himself over with a resignation that suggested he had perhaps known all along how this particular story would end. It is said that the Sicilians, who had suffered under the chaos of competing Roman factions for longer than they cared to remember, received Pompey's arrival with something close to relief, that the markets of Syracuse and Agrigentum began to breathe again, that the ships moved in and out of harbor with less fear, that ordinary life reasserted itself in the way it always does when a firm hand imposes, however harshly, the predictability that commerce and agriculture and daily human need require. Pompey conducted his business on the island with efficiency and a certain cold deliberateness that impressed his supporters and unsettled nearly everyone else. There were trials, and the trials produced the results that Sulla's party required. There were executions, and the executions were carried out without apparent hesitation or regret. The Roman commander who arrived to remove him from his command, a man named Gaius Memmius, is said to have called Pompey by a name meant to sting. The Carnifex adolescens, the young butcher, and the phrase had that particular quality that truly effective insults possess, which is that it contained just enough truth to lodge itself in memory and resist easy dismissal. Pompey received the name without visible wound and sailed on to Africa. Africa, the Roman province that occupied the northern coast of the continent, the land of Carthage's ghost and of a deep, dry, luminous heat that bore no resemblance to anything the hills of Picenum had prepared him for, presented a different kind of problem. The remnants of Marian resistance had gathered there under Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, who had allied himself with Hiarbus, the king of Numidia, and together they commanded forces substantial enough that a less confident commander might have paused to consider whether caution was in order. Pompey did not pause. He had the gift, or perhaps the habit, of seeing the gap between what an enemy appeared to be and what that enemy actually was when the moment of commitment arrived, and Africa offered him this gap in generous measure. The campaign itself moved with a momentum that seemed almost to surprise the landscape it crossed, the rocky scrubland, the great open distances, the air that shimmered with heat, even in the early months of the year. Domitius met him in the field, and the battle, when it came, was fierce enough that the ancient sources remember it as a real contest, rather than a foregone conclusion. But the outcome fell as it so often did when Pompey commanded. Decisively, cleanly, and in favor of the young man from Picenum who had never once held a formal magistracy, and who had built his armies not from the machinery of the Roman state, but from the loyalty of his own tenants and clients and neighbors. Domitius fell in the fighting, or in the immediate aftermath of it, and Hiarbus was deposed not long after. The Numidian throne settled on a ruler more amenable to Roman preference. The province was secured. The grain would flow. Order of the particular Roman kind had been restored. What followed the victory has the quality of a scene that those who witnessed it never quite forgot, or so the later accounts suggest. The soldiers, flushed with success and the peculiar generosity that comes over men when danger is past and the sun is warm and they are alive, acclaimed their general in the old and potent fashion. They called him Magnus the Great, and the title rang out across the African plain with a sincerity that distinguished it from flattery. Pompey was 24, or perhaps 25, and the greatest name that the Roman world had yet produced as a living honorific was being pressed upon him by men who had bled for him and believed, in the uncomplicated way that soldiers believe in a commander who has not let them be killed, that he deserved it. He did not refuse the name. He carried it back to Italy with him, along with his legions and his prisoners and the wealth of his African campaign. And when he presented himself outside Rome and requested a triumph, the magnificent procession through the streets of the city, that was the ultimate validation of military achievement. The political situation became suddenly, quietly complicated. Sulla, it is said, was not entirely pleased. A triumph required a triumph's prerequisites, among them the holding of appropriate Roman office, and Pompey held none, had never stood for election, had moved through the machinery of Roman military achievement entirely outside the constitutional channels that were supposed to govern such things. To grant him a triumph was to acknowledge something irregular, something that bent the rules in a way that rules were not designed to bend. And yet Sulla, who had remade Rome at sword's point, and who presumably understood better than most men that rules were instruments of power rather than its masters, is said to have relented, perhaps because Pompey pressed with that same immovable calm that had served him in Sicily and Africa, perhaps because Sulla recognized in the young man from Picenum a force that it was more useful to honor than to frustrate. The triumph was granted. The procession moved through the city. The crowds gathered as they always gathered for such things, drawn by spectacle and the deep Roman appetite for ceremony, for the visible proof that the world was being managed and that someone imposing was managing it. The details that the ancient sources preserve from that day have the texture of things people remembered afterward with a kind of half-embarrassed wonder. It is said that Pompey had arranged for a chariot to be drawn by elephants, the exotic, enormous creatures that were supposed to speak of Africa, of distance, of conquest on a scale that ordinary Roman victories did not encompass, and that the elephants proved too wide to pass through the city gate, so that the chariot had to be changed at the last moment, and the young general entered the city in a more conventional fashion. There is something almost gentle in this detail, something that the gravity of the occasion could not quite suppress. The great conqueror, the butcher, the newly named Magnus, stymied at the gate by his own elephants. Rome laughed, or smiled at least, and Pompey rode through the streets in the plain light of a Roman afternoon, while somewhere nearby the Tiber moved along its banks in its slow, indifferent way, the water carrying the ordinary city downstream, as it had always done and would go on doing long after the triumph was finished, and the crowds dispersed, and the young general went home to whatever came next. And what came next was the harder question, the one that the triumph, for all its splendor, could not answer. Pompey had proven himself in the field, beyond any reasonable dispute. He had the name, the reputation, the loyalty of soldiers, the grudging acknowledgement of Sulla himself, but he had no office, no place in the Senate's ranks that had been earned through the slow, prescribed progression of Roman public life, no political home from which to exercise the power that his campaigns had made undeniable. He was the most celebrated young man in Rome, and one of the most uncertain, and in the years that followed, he would learn, slowly, sometimes painfully, what it meant to be powerful in a world that had not yet decided where to put you. That story, too, is a quiet one, and it will keep it till the next time we rest together in the dark. The water moves along the Tiber's banks tonight, as it moved on that triumph afternoon, carrying the city's reflections downstream in long, trembling ribbons of light. There is a particular quality to the light in Rome in the hours before midday, when the sun has climbed just high enough to clear the rooftops of the Palatine and falls in long, warm columns through the gaps between the insulae, the great stacked apartment buildings that lean over the narrow streets like tired old men resting against one another for support. The stones of the Sacra Via hold that warmth long after the light has moved on, releasing it slowly into the afternoon air, and the smell of it, warm tufa and travertine, old dust, the faint sweetness of cypress wood from some carpenter's workshop nearby, is a smell that would have been as familiar to a Roman of the 1st century before the birth of Christ as the smell of your own home is familiar to you now. It is into that particular light, that particular warmth, that we step this evening to find a man who had every reason to feel at ease in his city, and who found instead that the city looked at him with a gaze that was difficult to read. Pompey had come back from Africa in the year that most historians place around 79 years before the birth of Christ. Wreathed in laurel, his soldiers cheering behind him, his name already carrying that extraordinary cognomen, Magnus the Great, which Sulla had perhaps given him with a mixture of genuine admiration and private amusement. He was in his middle 20s. He had raised armies from his own estates, crossed to Sicily, reduced it to order, crossed further to Africa, and shattered the forces arrayed against Sulla's settlement with a speed and efficiency that left observers slightly breathless. He had insisted on a triumph, had been refused it by the old terms of the constitution, and had pressed his demands so coolly and persistently that Sulla, who was not a man accustomed to being outmaneuvered by young men from Picenum, had eventually relented. The triumph had been magnificent, if slightly awkward at one moment. It is said that Pompey had intended to enter the city in a chariot drawn by elephants, which would have been a suitably theatrical gesture, but that the gate proved too narrow for the great animals, and horses had to be used instead. The story, whether entirely true or slightly embellished in the retelling, captures something of Pompey's situation in those years, a man of enormous energy and ambition and genuine capability, who kept finding that the existing structures of Roman life were not quite wide enough to accommodate him as he wished to be accommodated. The difficulty was this: Rome in the late Republic ran on a particular track, a sequence of offices that a man of the senatorial class was expected to move along in a prescribed order. The quaestorship first, then the aedileship, then the praetorship, and finally, for those of sufficient distinction, the consulship. This cursus honorum, this course of honors, was not merely a formality. It was the grammar through which Roman public life expressed itself, the system by which a man proved his fitness for increasing responsibility, built relationships with colleagues, learned the texture of the city's governance from the inside. Pompey had not followed this path. He had gone directly from his father's military household into the field, raised legions as a private citizen, and won his distinction entirely outside the structures that normally conferred it. He was, in the eyes of many of his contemporaries, a very famous man who held no office, had held no office, and had no clear right to hold the offices that would normally follow from a distinguished career. This made him something that Rome had no comfortable category for. He was too powerful to ignore, too celebrated to snub, too young to be treated as a grand old elder statesman. He moved through the forums and the porticos of the city with the careful ease of a man who knows that people are watching him, who knows that his bearing is itself a kind of argument. His physical presence helped him. Ancient sources describe him as tall, with an open, handsome face, and a particular way of dropping his eyes when meeting someone of importance, a gesture that read simultaneously as modesty and as confidence so deeply rooted that it required no display. His hair swept back from his forehead in a way that, it is said, reminded people of portraits of Alexander of Macedon, and it is equally said that Pompey was not entirely unconscious of this resemblance, though whether he cultivated it deliberately or simply allowed the comparison to develop is one of those small human questions that history cannot quite answer. The years between his return from Africa and his great commands of the 60s were not idle ones, but they were years in which the kind of distinction Pompey was accumulating was not quite the kind that Roman institutions knew how to reward. He married during this period. His wife Antistia had been set aside in circumstances that were painful for her family, and Pompey had then married Aemilia, the stepdaughter of Sulla himself, a match that was politically legible even if its personal dimensions were complicated, since Aemilia was already married to another man and was with child when the arrangement was made. She died not long after coming to Pompey's house in childbirth, and the whole episode has about it the slightly coercive quality of political arrangements made in haste. Pompey would later marry Mucia, and with her he would have something closer to a settled domestic life, the kind of life that produced children and conversations over the evening meal, and a household that moved at the slower rhythms of ordinary Roman days. He watched Sulla's dictatorship, and then he watched Sulla's retirement. Sulla laid down his extraordinary powers in a manner that astonished Rome, walking away from absolute authority and retiring to his estate in Campania, where it is said he spent his final months writing his memoirs and fishing, which is perhaps the most unexpectedly peaceful ending imaginable for one of the most violent men of the age. Sulla died in 78 years before the birth of Christ, and with him went the particular political shelter that had allowed Pompey to exist as an anomaly, a young man of vast and formal power operating just outside the normal rules. The Senate, relieved of Sulla's intimidating presence, was inclined to reassert its own dignity, and that meant reasserting the cursus honorum, the proper order of things. Into this slightly stiffened atmosphere came a crisis that gave Pompey a way forward. The consul Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, not to be confused with the later triumvir of the same name, had begun moving in a direction that alarmed the Senate, raising troops and making gestures toward reversing Sulla's settlement. When Lepidus was defeated, and the remnants of his forces were driven north under a commander named Marcus Junius Brutus, the father of the more famous Brutus, who would one day stand over another body in another Rome, Pompey was sent by the Senate to assist in dealing with them. He did so efficiently, and it is said that when Brutus surrendered under a promise of safe conduct, Pompey's officers killed him anyway, an action that would be noted later by those who compiled the ledger of Pompey's conduct toward defeated enemies. More importantly, Pompey was then given an extraordinary commission to go to Spain, where Quintus Sertorius had established what was in essence an alternative Roman state, complete with its own senate, drawing on the deep wells of loyalty that his years of extraordinary generalship had created among the Spanish peoples. The war against Sertorius would take years, and it would be hard, and it would not cover Pompey with the uncomplicated glory of his African campaign. Sertorius was one of the most gifted soldiers Rome ever produced, and the Spanish hills and valleys were nothing like the open plains where Pompey's speed and decisiveness had served him so well. But the commission itself mattered. It was another step in the strange, irregular path that Pompey was cutting through the conventions of Roman public life, a path that kept leading him to places where the normal rules had already been suspended, where the ordinary career structures had been set aside in favor of emergency, and where a man with armies and a famous name could be useful in ways that a man with offices and precedence could not. When at last the Spanish War wound toward its close, Sertorius killed by his own officers in a conspiracy that saved Pompey the difficulty of defeating him in the field. Pompey returned to Italy to find yet another emergency waiting for him: the great slave uprising under Spartacus, which had already been largely suppressed by the time Pompey arrived, leaving him the slightly awkward role of mopping up the remnants, a role he performed effectively enough, but which gave Crassus, who had done the harder fighting, some cause for resentment. And so he arrived at the consulship he had long deserved and technically had no right to hold, elected alongside Crassus in 67 years before the birth of Christ, years before he had reached the proper age, years before he had held the offices that were supposed to precede it. And the Senate and the city accepted this because what else could they do? Because the man standing outside the gates was the man who had just come back from Spain with an army, and Rome was a city that understood, beneath all its ceremonies and dignities, what armies meant. He had found his way through as he always found his way through, and outside the windows of the houses on the Esquiline and the Aventine, the small lamps burned on through the evening, their flames moving just slightly in the late air coming up from the river, steady and warm, and indifferent to the calculations of any particular man's ambition, burning as they had always burned, as they would go on burning through the long, quiet nights ahead. The last light has gone from the hills now, slipping away behind the western ridgeline as though it was simply tired, as though even the sun must rest after the long work of the day, and the Roman camp settles into the particular hush that belongs only to this hour, the hour between the evening trumpet call and the full dark, when 10,000 men breathe out together, and the business of war is set aside, at least until morning comes again to call it back. Somewhere in the middle distance, a mule shifts its weight, and the chain at its neck rings softly, once, and then is still. The smell of the camp rises around you, if you were standing at its edge and breathing slowly. Wood smoke first, always wood smoke, the thin blue columns of it threading upward from 100 cook fires, carrying with them the scent of rendered fat and spelt porridge and the faintly sour edge of pasca. That rough mixture of water and vinegar that soldiers have drunk since soldiers first learned to march. Beneath the smoke there is leather, always leather, oiled and dried and oiled again, the smell of thousands of belts and sandal straps and shield covers, of saddle pads and tent flaps, all of it worked by hand until it is supple enough to bear another day's use without cracking. And beneath the leather, the earth itself, the specific earth of wherever the army has stopped this week, loosened and churned by the feet of legions, turned over and over until it has released every smell it held. The camp itself was never accidental. A Roman army on the march did not simply stop and lie down when it grew tired, the way a herd of animals might press itself into a hillside for warmth. There was a form to it, a ritual almost, as precise as any ceremony performed on the steps of a temple in Rome. Every evening, before the column came to rest, surveyors and engineering detachments moved ahead, and they measured the ground with their groma instruments, those elegant crossed frames that allowed straight lines to be drawn across even irregular terrain. And they marked out in the dust and the grass the shape of what was to come, the praetorium at the center, the general's tent and the headquarters of command, and spreading outward from it in ordered rectangles the centuries and cohorts and their allotted spaces, each maniple knowing where its ground would be before a single tent peg had yet been driven. By the time the bulk of the army arrived, footsore and hungry, the skeleton of the knight's home was already sketched into the world. Then the digging began, because a Roman camp did not merely occupy ground, it transformed it. A ditch was cut around the entire perimeter, a vallum of earth piled up from the excavation to form a rampart, and along the top of that rampart wooden stakes were planted. Carried by the soldiers themselves as part of their standard load, those stakes that the legionaries grumbled about on every march, but never once failed to carry, because every soldier understood in his bones what it meant to sleep inside a wall, and what it meant to sleep without one. The work was hard, and it was done tired, but it was done every night without exception, whether the army had marched 5 miles that day or 25, because the discipline was not a burden laid upon these men from outside. It had become, after years of service, simply the shape of how they lived. Once the rampart was raised, and the gates set and the sentries at their posts, something in the camp softened. The sentry fires bloomed one after another, across the interior like a slow constellation coming to life. Each contubernium, those small units of 8 men who shared a tent and a mule and a grinding stone and all the intimate daily frictions of close living, gathering around its own small hearth. The grinding stones were a sound all their own in the early evening, the heavy rhythmic turning of grain into flour, the coarse spelt that formed the foundation of the soldier's diet. Each group of 8 men took their turn at this work, and the sound of it moved through the camp in overlapping waves, this low stone rumble, unhurried and familiar, the sound of supper being made. The bread or flat cakes that came from this flour were baked directly in the coals or in small portable clay ovens that the more comfortable units had found ways to carry, and they emerged blackened at their edges and dense and warm. And a soldier who had walked 20 miles in leather sandals with 40 pounds of kit on his back found them, it is said, as fine as anything served in the finest house on the Palatine Hill. He would eat with his contubernials, his tent mates, the 7 other men he had fought beside and argued with, and shared his blanket against the cold with. And the conversation around those fires was the same conversation men have always had around fires at the end of hard days, easy and low and often funny, full of complaints about officers who were safely out of earshot, full of speculation about where the army was headed next, and what the ground would be like, and whether the supply wagons would catch up before anyone had to go hungry again. The officers moved through the camp in the middle hours of the evening, centurions making their rounds with that unmistakable air of perpetual mild suspicion. That was the centurion's natural expression, checking that sentries were alert and fires were banked to a safe height. and that no one had been foolish enough to bring wine into camp in excess of the unspoken allowance that everyone pretended did not exist. The tribunes, young men of good family, many of them, making their first real acquaintance with the army, walked with more uncertainty and tried to project a confidence they were still building, and somewhere at the center of it all, in the praetorium, the general's lamp burned, a single steady orange light visible from many parts of the camp if you knew where to look for it. A lamp that seemed to say, the mind at the center of this enterprise is still working, still planning, still holding the whole of this vast moving thing in some kind of order. The watches of the night were divided into 4, each roughly 3 hours, and the soldiers rotated through them in an arrangement overseen by the officer of the day, who received each watch's password and distributed it outward through the cohorts. A single Latin word changed every night, something plain and easy to remember in the dark, when challenge and response needed to happen quickly and without confusion. The story goes that the password was sometimes taken from the name of a god, sometimes from a virtue, sometimes from something more practical and immediate. Whatever it was, it passed from mouth to mouth in the dark like a small ceremony, a quiet act of belonging. You knew the word, and so you were part of this thing, this army, this temporary city of tents. By the second watch, the camp had grown deeply quiet, the fires mostly embers now, the stone glow of them enough to see a hand by, but no more. Inside the leather tents, men lay in their cloaks and their wool tunics, close enough together that the warmth of bodies accumulated, and the cold of the Italian night, or the Sicilian night, or whatever night this happened to be, was held at some distance. The mules in their picket lines breathed audibly in the dark. An owl passed over once without a sound from its wings, which is the particular magic of owls. The sentries on the rampart paced in their slow prescribed arcs, wrapped in their cloaks, watching the dark beyond the ditch for anything that moved when nothing should be moving. This was the Roman army not as it appeared in triumph, wreathed in laurel and moving through cheering crowds, not as it appeared in battle, terrifying and methodical in its advance, but as it simply was, night after night, in all the uncelebrated hours between one campaign day and the next. This was where the real texture of military life lived, in the grinding of the grain and the smell of the cook fire and the low voices of men who were tired and far from home and still somehow here, still inside the wall they had built for themselves before the sun went down. And the fires that burned at the heart of those small groups of 8, the fires that gave light enough to eat by and warmth enough to feel almost comfortable, those fires were the true center of the Republic's military world, as they had been for generations before and would be for generations to come, quiet, essential, requiring nothing of the men around them except that they stay near. Tomorrow, by sea, a different kind of campaign would begin, one that would sweep across the entire breadth of the Mediterranean world, bringing with it a kind of order that even the most ambitious Roman had never quite dared to imagine possible in a single season's work. But that is still ahead, still wrapped in the dark, and for now there is only the ember glow and the breathing of sleeping men and the long, still peace of a camp at rest. The salt air comes first, before anything else, that particular heaviness that settles on the tongue when you are near the Mediterranean in the long, dry weeks of late summer, when the sea lies flat and pale, and the fishing boats have not come back for 3 days, and no one on the docks will say exactly why. It was that kind of silence that had fallen over much of the Roman world by the time Pompey stepped forward to accept what history would remember as one of the most remarkable commissions ever granted to a single man. The silence of empty harbors, the silence of merchant families waiting for ships that would not return, a silence of grain warehouses along the Tiber standing lower and lower, the great clay amphorae tilting in their racks with diminishing weight, and the people of Rome feeling it first in the price of bread, then in the length of the queues, then in the low and gathering murmur of a city that is beginning to be afraid. The pirates of the Mediterranean had not appeared suddenly. They had grown, slowly and then all at once, the way a fire grows in a wall, invisible for a long time, then everywhere. The story goes that their numbers had swelled during the long decades of Roman civil conflict and Eastern war, filling the spaces that Roman order had briefly vacated. They came from many places, from the jagged coves of Cilicia, along the southern coast of what we now call Turkey, where the cliffs dropped straight into deep water and a small fleet could vanish into a maze of sea passages that only the locals knew, from the splintered islands of the Aegean, from forgotten harbors on the African coast. They were not, most of them, simple thieves. They were organized, equipped, ambitious. They had fortified towns on those Cilician heights. They had fleets of swift vessels, low and dark and quick, built for interception rather than cargo. They had intelligence networks and safe harbors, and it is said, something approaching their own civic life. Councils, alliances, even a kind of rough ceremony up in the stone fastnesses above the sea. By the middle of the 70s before the birth of Christ, they had become audacious enough to raid the Italian coast itself. The story goes that they once seized 2 Roman praetors, magistrates of the Republic, complete with their attendants and the crimson-bordered togas of their office, and carried them away across the water with a kind of theatrical contempt, as though the robes of Roman authority were merely colorful cloth. They had raided the port of Ostia, Rome's own harbor, and burned ships in the inner roads. They had plucked wealthy Romans from the coastal roads of Campania and held them for ransom in those cliff-top Cilician strongholds, laughing, it was said, when their captives reminded them they were Roman citizens. One famous captive from those years, the story belongs to a later chapter, would carry the memory of his captivity like a coal under his ribs for the rest of his life. But that is another man's story. For Rome, the consequences were not merely humiliation. The sea lanes were the arteries of the Republic's food supply. Egypt sent grain, Sicily sent grain, Africa sent grain. When those lanes fell into disorder, the city of perhaps 1 million souls, enormous, restless, dependent on its imports, the way a great fire is dependent on wood being brought to it, began to starve at the edges first, and then more widely. The Senate had attempted several campaigns against the pirates over the years. The pirates had absorbed those campaigns the way the sea absorbs a stone, with a brief disturbance, then nothing. Into this situation came the tribune Aulus Gabinius in the year 67 before the birth of Christ, with a proposal that made the more conservative members of the Senate go quite still. He proposed that a single man be granted command over the entire Mediterranean and all coasts within 50 miles of the sea, an area so vast it encompassed most of the known world's commerce, along with a fleet, an army, and resources drawn from the treasury on a scale that had no real precedent. The command was to last 3 years, and although the law named no name, everyone understood whose name it meant. There was opposition, and it was fierce, and it was in the way of all fierce opposition in those last years of a republic, ultimately futile. The people of Rome, who felt the weight of empty grain stores most directly, voted for the Gabinian law with something close to desperation. Pompey, who had made a performance of reluctant acceptance, the sources are somewhat dry on how convincing it was, received his command. What he did next has the quality of something so swift and so complete that it seems almost dreamlike when you slow down to trace it. He divided the Mediterranean into 13 sectors, assigning a subordinate commander to each with a portion of the fleet. And the fleet itself was extraordinary. More than 500 ships, gathered from across the Republic's resources, along with perhaps 120,000 soldiers and a cavalry force of some thousands of horsemen, moving along the coasts. The numbers in the ancient sources vary, and some scholars treat them gently, but all agree on the essential shape of what followed. A simultaneous coordinated sweep, working from west to east, designed so that no pirate fleet could simply slip away from one area into another, because every area was being closed at once. The western Mediterranean was cleared in roughly 40 days. 40 days, a number so precise and so astonishing that the ancient sources repeated almost with a kind of wonder, as though they could not quite believe what they were recording. The pirates of the western seas, finding nowhere to run, began to surrender, or were destroyed, or simply vanished back into the hidden coves, only to find those coves watched as well. And then Pompey himself moved east, toward Cilicia, where the problem had its roots and its strongholds. He could, at this point, simply have crushed what remained. The sea was already transformed, those gray merchant vessels sitting lower and heavier in the water with their cargo undisturbed, the docks beginning to fill again with the smell of spilled grain and olive oil and the wet rope of unloading. But Pompey did something that the sources note with a kind of approval, tinged with mild surprise. He offered terms. To the pirates who had surrendered or who were willing to lay down their resistance, he offered not execution, but resettlement, land in depopulated areas of the eastern provinces, a chance to become something other than what they had been. It is said that this was not pure generosity, but practical wisdom, the understanding that desperate men in good soil become farmers, and farmers do not raid grain ships. But whatever the reasoning, the policy worked. The remaining pirate strongholds in Cilicia were reduced, some by force, most by a combination of siege and negotiation. And by the autumn of that same year, the Mediterranean was, for the first time in a generation, essentially clear. The whole campaign had lasted less than 3 months. 3 months, from the moment Pompey's fleet moved until the sea lanes reopened, and the grain began to flow again into the hungry city. Even those senators who had most loudly opposed the Gabinian law were left with very little to say. The speed of it was the argument. The bread was the argument. The quiet harbor was the argument. There is something worth resting with for a moment in the image of that Mediterranean in the weeks after the campaign ended. Late in the year, the light going golden and low across the water, the sea flattening in the long autumn calms, and the small lanterns on fishing boats beginning to appear again in the bays where for years fishermen had not dared to go out after dark. Those lights on the water, scattered and warm and unhurried, moving with the gentle rhythm of a boat at anchor, or drifting with the tide, they meant something to the people watching from the shore. They meant that ordinary life had been returned to them, that the sea was no longer an adversary, but a road again, stretching westward toward Italy and eastward toward everything the world still held. Pompey himself was already looking east. His armies were provisioned. His fleet was intact. His reputation stood at a height few Romans had ever reached. And somewhere beyond the horizon of that calm sea, in the mountains and river valleys of the Far East, a very old war was still waiting for someone to finish it. The king of Pontus, Mithridates, who had fought Rome for decades with a patience that bordered on the geological, was still there, still moving, still holding together some remnant of his ambition. And the general who had been fighting him for years was exhausted, his armies restless, his supplies uncertain. Pompey would not need long to decide, but for now, let the ships rest in their harbors, and let the lights on the water burn quietly until morning, and let the sound of the Mediterranean in its restored peace be the last thing that carries you toward sleep. The dust had not yet settled from the last pirate camp when the orders came. New orders, broader orders, orders that seemed to reach beyond the edges of any map a Roman cartographer had yet attempted to draw. Somewhere to the east, far beyond the familiar blue of the Aegean and the cedar-scented ports of Cilicia, a war had been smoldering for the better part of 2 decades, banked and rebanked, like a fire that refuses to go out no matter how many times tired hands have thrown water upon it. And at the center of that fire, enduring, patient, adaptable as smoke, was a king. His name was Mithridates, and he had been the great eastern problem of Rome's late republic for so long that entire generations of soldiers had grown old fighting him and returned home still without a resolution, still without a clean ending to carry back to the forum and lay down like a trophy at the feet of the Senate. The man who had most recently tried and come heartbreakingly close was Lucius Licinius Lucullus, a general of real genius, a man who understood supply lines and mountain terrain and the shifting temperament of eastern armies, but who had at last been undone, not by Mithridates, but by his own soldiers, who had grown so weary of marching deeper into Asia year after year, so hollow with hunger and distance and longing for home, that they had simply stopped. They had sat down in the dust of Pontus and refused to go further. And there is something almost unbearably human in that moment. Those thousands of tired men in the middle of an incomprehensible landscape, the wind moving through the dry grass around them, the mountains rising in every direction, like walls they could not scale and could not stop seeing. Lucullus returned to Rome having lost control of his army, his command stripped quietly away, and the war left unfinished, like a sentence interrupted, mid-thought. Into this Pompey now rode, quite literally, moving eastward with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already, in the span of a single campaigning season, made the entire Mediterranean safe for Roman ships. The law that had given him this new command, the Lex Manilia, proposed in the year 66 before the birth of Christ, had been remarkably broad, granting him authority over the armies already in the east, and the freedom to wage war and make peace as he saw fit, a degree of personal power that made certain senators in Rome shift uncomfortably in their stone seats, though they found it difficult to argue against a man who had just cleared the sea of pirates with such spectacular efficiency. He met Lucullus somewhere in the highlands of Galatia, and the story goes that the two men, both of proud and somewhat brittle temperament, managed almost immediately to dislike one another with a thoroughness that impressed even those around them, who had seen Roman generals quarrel before. Lucullus, it is said, looked at the fresh, well-supplied troops Pompey brought with him, and felt the particular bitterness of a man who has done the hardest work and will receive none of the credit. Pompey, for his part, looked at the exhausted remnants of Lucullus's armies, men thin as winter branches, their sandals worn through, their eyes carrying the particular flatness of soldiers who have marched too far, and understood with the practical clarity that was one of his genuine gifts that these were men who needed rest before they could be asked to fight anyone at all. He gave it to them, he fed them, he waited until the color had returned to their faces and something, like soldiers' pride, had returned to their bearing, and then he moved. Mithridates himself was a figure of almost mythological persistence. He had been king of Pontus, that kingdom hugging the southern shore of the Black Sea, since he was perhaps 11 or 12 years old, and he had spent his entire long life in the anticipation and prosecution of conflict. It is said that he had trained himself from youth to resist poison, taking small doses each day so that no assassin's cup could find purchase in his body, a practice so famous that it passed into legend and eventually into the Latin language itself. He spoke, by some accounts, the languages of more than 20 of the peoples he ruled or traded with or warred against, and he moved through the complicated human geography of the Eastern world with a fluency that no Roman general, however brilliant, could quite match on his own ground. But fluency was not enough, in the end, to stop Pompey. What followed through the mountainous country of Pontus and Armenia and the wild territories beyond was less a single decisive battle than a long, methodical, dust-raising pursuit. A campaign conducted in passes thick with the smell of pine resin and cold stone, along rivers whose names the Roman soldiers had to learn phonetically and would forget again by winter. Pompey drove Mithridates northward and eastward with a patience that was itself a kind of pressure, cutting off supply routes, negotiating with the king's neighbors, turning ally after potential ally away from the old king, until Mithridates found himself increasingly alone in the geography of the world. There was a night battle in the highlands, somewhere in the country of Pontus, in which Pompey used the rising of the moon with a tactical elegance that ancient writers would later admire at length, positioning his forces so that the soldiers of Mithridates, facing the light, could not clearly see what was moving toward them through the silver and shadow. And in the confusion that followed, the king's army broke, and Mithridates himself fled northward on horseback with a much reduced retinue and whatever of his treasury could be carried quickly. He found temporary refuge at the court of his son-in-law Tigranes, the king of Armenia. Though that shelter did not last, Tigranes had his own arrangements to negotiate with Pompey, his own survival to consider, and he met the Roman general with a submission both theatrical and carefully calculated, laying his crown at Pompey's feet in a gesture that ancient writers described was something between admiration and amusement. Pompey gave the crown back. It was the kind of gesture Pompey was good at, large and legible, generous in a way that was also a demonstration of power, and Tigranes went home to his highland kingdom diminished but intact, which was likely the best outcome either of them had privately expected. Mithridates himself fled north of the Black Sea, into the territories of the Crimea and the steppe lands beyond, carried on the wind of his own restlessness toward whatever fragments of a kingdom he might reconstitute there. He would never see Pompey again. He would never in fact return from those cold northern distances, though his end, when it finally came, was shaped as much by the faithlessness of his own family as by anything Rome had done. But that is a story that moves in its own direction, and the important thing, the thing that Pompey's soldiers understood as they watched him consolidate the eastern world around them, was that the war, The long, exhausting war that had swallowed so many years and so many men was functionally over. What followed was something Pompey seemed almost to enjoy as much as the fighting itself. He turned south and east, moving through the ancient lands of Asia with the unhurried authority of a man making himself at home, receiving embassies and delegations, settling borders and tribute arrangements, founding cities in his own name or refounding older ones, threading the Roman world deeper into territories that had previously existed only as rumors on the edges of geography. Governors and tetrarchs and petty kings came to him with their grievances and their gifts, and Pompey sat in his camp beneath lamps that burned through the warm eastern evenings, listening, deciding, dispensing, shaping the world into legible Roman order. The soldiers around him learned to sleep to the sounds of those evenings, the creak of leather tent poles, the murmur of translators working in half a dozen tongues, the occasional distant bark of camp dogs, moving through the darkness on their own patrol, and always, just below everything, the soft hiss of oil lamps, guttering in whatever small wind found its way through the camp's loosely gathered edges, that ancient sound of light maintaining itself against the dark, patient and constant as the stars that burned above the plateau. Those distant fires, those sleeping armies, those lamplit tents full of maps and correspondence, and the dusty smell of a world being remade, all of it was moving now toward the great ancient cities of the East, toward the harbors and the libraries and the garden smells of Alexandria and Antioch and Jerusalem, each city a world unto itself, each carrying its own long history like a lamp held carefully through a long night. That world was waiting, just ahead, in the next unfolding of the journey. Somewhere between the last embers of a campaign fire and the first gray light of a new morning, the ancient East simply breathes. And if you let your eyes grow heavy now, if you let the words carry you gently outward across the dark water, you will find yourself standing at the edge of a world so old and so layered with human memory that Rome itself, for all its proud marble, felt young beside it. This is a chapter without battles, without orders given or decisions made. It is only a wandering, a slow drift through the cities that shaped the eastern Mediterranean, long before Pompey arrived with his legions and his extraordinary authority, and that would go on shaping the world long after he had passed through their gates and moved on. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders settle. There is nothing here that requires your urgency, only stone and light, and the smell of things growing in warm places far from home. Alexandria first, because Alexandria demands to come first. It sat at the edge of Egypt, like a dream that Egypt itself had not quite been able to imagine, a Greek city wearing Egyptian light built on a narrow tongue of land between the sea and a great inland lake, so that water surrounded it on nearly every side, and the air was always faintly salt, always faintly cool, even in the height of summer when the rest of the world baked and cracked. The streets of Alexandria were wider than any street in Rome, laid out in a great grid of elegant simplicity, and they were paved with stone so pale it seemed almost to glow at midday, so that walking them in the afternoon was like walking across a surface gently lit from within. Date palms stood at intervals along the broader avenues, their long fronds moving in the sea wind with a slow papery sound, a sound like the turning of pages in a very large library, which was not in Alexandria merely a poetic comparison, because the library was here, the great library, the one the world still whispers about, where it is said that at its height, the scrolls numbered something close to 700,000, stacked and catalogued and breathed upon by scholars who came from every corner of the known world to sit in its cool colonnaded rooms and read. You might imagine the smell of that place, papyrus and cedar oil, the faint must of old ink, the linen wrappings of scrolls that had been rolled and unrolled 10,000 times. You might imagine the quiet that lived inside those rooms, broken only by the scratch of a stylus on wax, or the soft murmur of a reader working through a text aloud in the habit of the ancient world, where reading silently to oneself was considered almost eccentric. Outside, the city went on being magnificent, the harbor with its lighthouse, the Pharos, rising so improbably high from its island that sailors claimed, and the story goes this, with perhaps some exaggeration, that its fire could be seen from a distance of nearly 50 Roman miles on a clear night, a fire fed constantly by men who climbed the interior stairs with armloads of wood, tending the flame as a kind of sacred duty, as if the light itself were alive and needed feeding. When Pompey moved through the eastern Mediterranean in those years of his extraordinary eastern command, he came not as a tourist, marveling at old stones, but as a man reshaping the political geography of half the world. And yet the cities through which he moved, or in whose shadow his decisions fell, carried an atmosphere entirely their own, entirely indifferent to Roman ambition. Antioch sat differently in the landscape, not on the water's edge, but inland, cradled in a valley between the Orontes River and a long ridge of mountain, so that the city was always held, always sheltered, always faintly aware of the heights above it where the evening air came cold and sharp off the stone. The river moved through the city with quiet authority, brown and deliberate, reflecting the columns of the great colonnaded street that ran along its bank. It is said that Antioch's colonnaded street was one of the wonders of the urban world, a covered walkway stretching for miles, so that a person could walk its entire length in shade, even at noon in August, protected from the sun by the stone roof overhead and the pillars to either side, while the city's commerce and conversation flowed through and around like water finding its level. The markets of Antioch smelled of Syria, of cumin and coriander ground in stone mortars, of sesame oil in great clay jars, of leather and wool dyed in colors that the Eastern craftsmen had been producing for generations, a particular saffron yellow, a particular deep red almost the color of dried blood, a particular blue that travelers remarked on again and again because it was not quite the color of the sky anywhere in the Mediterranean world, and not quite the color of the sea, but something in between, something specifically Antiochene. The city's evenings were long and warm, and it is said that the people of Antioch were known throughout the ancient world for the pleasure they took in outdoor life after dark, for the lamps lit in the gardens, for the music that spilled from open courtyards, for the particular quality of ease that the climate and the prosperity of the place made possible. When Pompey reorganized the eastern territories and made his administrative settlements, Antioch became the capital of the new Roman province of Syria, which meant that Roman officials would sit in its beautiful buildings, and Roman soldiers would walk its colonnaded streets, and Roman money would flow through its markets, and the city would absorb all of this the way old cities absorb everything, slowly, partially, on its own terms, continuing to smell of cumin and coriander, continuing to dye cloth in that particular blue. And then Jerusalem, which was neither a coastal city of Greek ambition like Alexandria, nor a river city of comfortable eastern prosperity like Antioch, but something older and stranger, and set high in a landscape of rocky hills where the light fell differently, where the air was drier, and the stone was a particular pale gold that turned rose-colored at sunrise and deep amber at sunset, and where the wind came in from the desert with a faint mineral smell, clean and ancient, and without anything green in it. Jerusalem lived around its great temple the way a fire lives around its source of heat. Everything oriented toward it, everything organized in relation to it, the whole city a kind of extended conversation with the sacred thing at its center. The temple precinct was enormous, its outer courts paved with great flat stones that rang faintly underfoot, its inner spaces reserved according to laws of increasing holiness, so that the city had a kind of spiritual topography as well as a physical one. Pilgrims came here from great distances, from communities of Jewish settlements scattered across Egypt and Syria and Asia Minor and places even further. And they came carrying not only their offerings, but their entire orientation toward this place, their sense that this particular hill, in this particular configuration of stone and light, was the axis of the world. The sound of Jerusalem was different from the sound of either Alexandria or Antioch. There was less of the sea, less of river water, less of the Mediterranean ease of trade and pleasure. Instead, there were the sounds of devotion, prayers in a language of great antiquity, the bleating of animals brought for sacrifice, the bells and trumpets that marked the hours of temple ritual, the low, persistent wind moving through the narrow streets of the upper city, carrying dust and the smell of cedar from the temple's great wooden beams, which were fragrant in the heat, releasing their resin into the air as a kind of continuous and involuntary offering. Pompey would come to Jerusalem in the course of his eastern settlement, drawn by a dispute between rival claimants to the city's throne, and what he did there, entering the temple precincts in a way that many found deeply transgressive, walking into places that the laws of that community reserved for its own priests, would be long remembered, not with anger precisely, but with a kind of sorrowful significance, as a moment that illustrated the enormous gap between the world Rome understood and the world these ancient eastern cities carried in their stones and their prayers. But this is a chapter for atmosphere, not for events. Let the wind from the Judean hills pass over you now. Let the lamplight of Alexandria's great waterfront soften and waver in the sea breeze. Let the smell of Antioch's markets, that warm, complex, spiced air, drift through your thoughts and grow slowly fainter as your breathing deepens and your mind releases its hold on the day. Pompey has gathered his eastern world, reorganized it with Roman efficiency, and named his provinces and his kings and his tributary arrangements, and now the road turns west again, back toward the harbor, back toward the ship that will carry him home across water he made safe with his own extraordinary season of campaigning. That homecoming waits just beyond this night's rest, the harbor full of ships, the crowd already beginning to gather, the most celebrated Roman of his age coming home to a city that does not quite know how to contain him. For now, only the lamplight, steady and small and warm, holding back the dark at the edges of the ancient world. The sea is behind him now, after years of eastern horizons, after the salt winds of a dozen coastlines, and the dry heat of Syrian plateaus, and the strange perfumed darkness of Jerusalem's narrow streets. The sea is behind Pompey the Great, and the hills of Italy are rising slowly ahead, green and familiar and impossibly ordinary in the pale autumn light. The water that carried him so far, that bore his fleets and answered his commands and carried the weight of so much history across its surface, now simply recedes, shrinking behind the hull of his ship, until it becomes a shimmer, a memory, a quiet brightness at the edge of things as Italy draws him in. He had been away for years, not merely absent in the way that a man is absent when he travels to a nearby province for a season, but truly, profoundly away, out beyond the familiar world, past the edges of what most Romans would ever see or smell or touch in their lifetimes. He had remade the eastern Mediterranean. He had settled kingdoms and named governors and drawn new lines on the map of the known world with the confident hand of a man who had never quite learned to doubt himself. He had pursued Mithridates of Pontus to the very margins of the inhabitable earth and watched him finally irreversibly fall. He had received the submission of rulers whose names his fellow Romans could barely pronounce. He had walked through cities that were old before Rome was even a thought. And now he was coming home. The news of his approach had traveled ahead of him in the way that important news always traveled in those years, on foot and horseback and by ship, passed from mouth to mouth, gathering weight and embellishment with every telling, until by the time Pompey's fleet was sighted off the Italian coast, the whole peninsula was already buzzing with something very close to awe. There were stories of his achievements, of course, told and retold until the numbers grew almost mythological. It is said that he had added vast new territories to Rome's dominion, that the treasury would swell enormously from the tribute of conquered peoples, that he had settled more than 30 cities and pacified more than a dozen kings. Whether every detail was precisely accurate in every particular mattered rather less than the emotional truth that people carried in their chests when they heard the stories, which was simply this: something enormous had happened out there in the east, and the man responsible for all of it was sailing home. He disembarked at Brundisium, on the southeastern heel of Italy, in the autumn of the year that was 62 years before the birth of Christ. The soldiers who had served under him, those who were returning to Italy with him, the veterans of the eastern campaigns, with their weathered faces and their particular way of walking that comes from years of marching, were dismissed there on the shore. This was itself a kind of statement, deliberate and legible to anyone watching with political eyes. There had been those in Rome who feared what a general arriving from the east might do, arriving with his legions at his back and all that accumulated power and loyalty at his disposal. History offered uncomfortable precedents. Sulla had marched on Rome. The fear was real and understandable, and spoken of only in careful voices behind closed doors. And so the dismissal of his troops at Brundisium was Pompey's answer to that unspoken fear. A gesture, graceful and perhaps a little theatrical, that said, "I am a citizen returning home, not a conqueror arriving to claim his prize." He traveled north toward Rome in the days that followed, and the road was lined. That is the detail that stays with you, imagining it. The road lined for mile after mile with people who had come out simply to see him pass. Farmers from their fields, merchants paused in their journeys, entire families standing together at the roadside in the thin autumn sunshine, watching the procession move slowly northward through the Italian landscape. It is said that so many people came out to meet him that the inns and roadside stopping places could not contain them all, and crowds spilled out into the fields and gathered along every stretch of road within sight of his approach. There was something almost tender in this, beneath the grandeur of it. Ordinary people, with their ordinary lives, and their ordinary worries about harvests and debts and the small difficulties of daily existence, setting those things aside for a morning or an afternoon to come and stand at the roadside and see the most famous man in the world go by. He arrived in Rome, and Rome embraced him. The triumph that was granted to him, his third and almost unimaginable distinction, was celebrated over 2 days, which was itself a measure of how much there was to show and to celebrate. The procession was immense. There were the spoils of conquered kingdoms displayed on wagons, gold and silver and fine cloth, and objects of such extravagant Eastern craftsmanship that Roman crowds pressed forward simply to look at them. There were prisoners and hostages from a bewildering array of peoples and places, their names and origins announced to the watching crowd. There were soldiers marching in their ranks. There were tablets carried aloft that enumerated in careful Roman fashion the precise accounting of what had been accomplished. How many ships taken, how many cities founded or refounded, how much gold and silver added to the treasury. The numbers were extraordinary. The watching crowds were very loud, and Pompey himself rode or walked through all of it, celebrated and garlanded and magnificent, the most powerful and admired Roman of his generation, the man who had swept the sea clean of pirates in a single season and chased an ancient king across 3 countries and reorganized the entire eastern Mediterranean world according to his own judgment. It was his 45th year. He was at the absolute summit of everything, and then, rather quietly, the summit revealed itself to be something other than what he had imagined. Because the peculiar thing, the thing that history records with a gentleness that is almost kind, is that after the triumph was over, after the crowds had gone home, and the garlands had wilted, and the last wagon of Eastern treasure had been wheeled away into the treasury, Pompey found that his position in Rome was not quite what his years of achievement might have led him to expect. He had wanted, among other things, for the Senate to ratify all of his Eastern settlements at once, in a single comprehensive act, to confirm the arrangements he had made, the kings he had installed, the territories he had organized, with the simple rubber stamp approval that seemed to him only appropriate given the scale of what he had accomplished. He had also wanted land granted to his veterans, the loyal men who had served him so faithfully across so many miles and so many campaigns. The Senate, as was its habit, moved slowly. There were senators who resented his extraordinary commands and his accumulated glory. There were those who picked over the details of his eastern settlements with the careful, suspicious attention of men who had not been there and did not entirely trust the judgment of someone who had. The ratification he wanted did not come quickly or easily. The land for his veterans became a matter of negotiation and delay, and the particular friction that Roman politics generated almost as a natural byproduct of its own processes. He had crossed deserts and outwitted kings, and he found himself frustrated by committees. There is something almost restful in this, viewed from the soft distance of 2,000 years and a quiet evening. Not tragic, not yet, not in this chapter of things, but simply very human. The greatest general of his age, sitting in Rome with his triumph behind him, and his enemies politely immovable before him, learning what it meant to be powerful in a city that distributed power carefully and jealously, and did not simply hand it over to the most accomplished man in the room. He had spent years in a world where his word was final, where the map reshaped itself at his instruction, where kings received him with anxious deference, Rome received him with applause, and then almost immediately reminded him that applause was not the same as authority. His house was full of light in those evenings, oil lamps burning through the late hours, the smell of warm stone and kitchen smoke drifting through the rooms, the sounds of the city outside going about its vast and different business. He had everything that a Roman of his era could have dreamed of possessing: wealth, fame, a name that was known across the known world, a face that strangers recognized on the street, and somewhere in the quiet rooms of that lamplit house, the next act of his life was already gathering itself, taking the slow shape of an arrangement that would tie him to other powerful men in ways that could not easily be undone. The lamps burned on, their small flames steady in the still evening air, while Rome turned in its sleep and morning waited patiently just beyond the hills. Somewhere in the city, a fire was burning low. You can almost feel it, that particular quality of Roman autumn settling over the hills. The way the evening air carried wood smoke down from the Palatine and spread it thin across the forum below, where the last of the day's merchants were packing their stalls and the temple priests were dimming the lamps in the outer colonnades, drawing the sacred spaces inward for the night. The city breathed differently in the evenings, slower, quieter, as if Rome itself understood that the business of daylight, the arguing and lobbying and scheming that filled every waking hour of its citizens, required a certain darkness to complete itself, to find its final shape in private rooms where no one was officially watching and no record would be kept. It is in such rooms, and in such an evening spirit, that we find the arrangement that history would later call the First Triumvirate taking its quiet form. The word triumvirate sounds formal, institutional, as though three men sat at a polished table and signed a document with wax seals and witnesses in togas. But that is not what happened. What happened was something more intimate and more Roman than that, a private understanding between three men who each needed something the others possessed, struck in the way that important Roman agreements so often were, not in the forum or the Senate house, but in someone's garden or vestibule, over wine, in the hour when lamplight softens every face and makes even difficult conversations seem possible. Pompey, by the year in which this understanding crystallized, which fell in the consulship of Metellus and Afranius, some 60 years before the birth of Christ, was the most celebrated man in Rome, and yet he was also, in a particular and frustrating way, stuck. He had returned from the east, trailing clouds of glory, having reorganized the kingdoms bordering the Mediterranean, having settled scores with Mithridates and Tigranes, having marched through Syria and Judea, and reshaped the Roman world's eastern edge with the confidence of a man who had the God's own approval for everything he did. He had disbanded his armies at Brundisium, as he had promised he would, with the magnanimity of a man absolutely certain that Rome would reward him swiftly and generously, and Rome had not. The Senate, whose older members remembered with considerable discomfort how large Pompey's shadow had always been, found reason after reason to delay the ratification of his eastern settlements and the land grants he had promised his veterans. The delays were polite, they were procedurally justified, and they were in the end deeply humiliating to a man who had believed that greatness was its own argument. Marcus Licinius Crassus suffered from a different variety of frustration. He was the wealthiest man in Rome by almost any measurement you chose to apply. His fortune had been built on property and silver mines and the particular ruthlessness with which he had acquired the estates of the proscribed during Sulla's time, buying them at ruinous discounts from men who were desperate to raise cash before they were killed. He had funded armies, backed politicians, and kept half the Senate in a state of quiet obligation. He had fought Spartacus and crucified thousands along the Appian Way, and yet Crassus never quite received the respect he felt his wealth and his service commanded. He was passed over for the kind of glory that Pompey seemed to collect simply by riding into a province and looking confident. He wanted, above all things, a great military command that might finally make his name immortal, rather than merely prosperous. In the year of this story, he wanted his tax collectors in Asia to have their contracts renegotiated by the Senate, and the Senate was proving obstructive about that as well. And then there was Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar in these years was younger than both men, younger by some years than Pompey, younger still in terms of his military reputation, though that reputation was growing steadily with each passing season. He was brilliant in a way that Rome had not quite seen before, or perhaps had seen, but never quite trusted. A mind that moved with the quick lateral intelligence of water, finding a path through stone, always finding the level it needed, always moving. He had debts, enormous debts, the kind that would have destroyed a lesser man, accumulated through years of spectacular public generosity, the games and feasts and gifts with which he had courted the popular vote, He wanted, in the year that this arrangement was taking shape, the consulship. He also wanted, beyond the consulship, a significant military command, something that would give him the resource and the time and the distance from his creditors to become what he had always believed himself capable of becoming. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent years calculating exactly what the Republic would and would not yield through ordinary channels, that he needed allies. The details of how these three men came to their understanding are not fully preserved in any single account, and the story goes that the early conversations were handled with great delicacy, with intermediaries and careful language, since none of the three wished to appear to be the one reaching out first. It is said that Caesar, characteristically, moved most deliberately, cultivating both men separately before suggesting that what benefited all three of them might be arranged together. Whether this is precisely true, or simply the kind of story that gathers around Caesar's name because it sounds so much like him, we cannot say with certainty. What we know is that by the time Caesar stood for the consulship that would fall in the year of Bibulus and Caesar himself, though Bibulus would be so thoroughly sidelined that Romans would joke about dating documents to the consulship of Julius and Caesar, the arrangement between the three men was real enough to function. Pompey contributed his prestige and his veteran soldiers, men who still adored him and who could be relied upon to make their wishes known to the assembly in ways that were not strictly violent, but were certainly emphatic. Crassus contributed money, which in Roman politics was never a small thing, and his network of obligations and influence throughout the equestrian class. Caesar contributed his consulship, through which he could push legislation directly, and his extraordinary ability to read a room, whether that room contained senators or soldiers, or the crowd in the forum, and give each audience exactly the words it needed to hear. And so the eastern settlements were ratified, and so the tax contracts were renegotiated to Crassus's satisfaction, and so the veterans received their land. Each man got what he needed, and the Republic, whose constitution had been designed over centuries to prevent exactly this kind of concentrated private arrangement, found itself bent around the edges without quite being broken, the way a lamp flame bends in a draught without going out, at least not yet. There is something worth sitting with, as you let this moment settle into the quieter part of your mind, about the particular texture of what these three men had made. It was not an empire. It was not a revolution. It was an agreement between private individuals who were also, collectively, the most powerful private individuals in the Roman world, and who had decided that the formal machinery of the Republic moved too slowly and too unreliably to serve their needs. They were not, in their own understanding, doing anything improper. Each of them had good legal arguments for what he wanted. Each of them was simply finding a more efficient path to outcomes that were, individually, entirely reasonable. This is how the Great Republic began to hollow itself, not through a single dramatic betrayal, but through a series of perfectly reasonable efficiency improvements, each one dimming the old ways a little further, the way a room grows darker not when someone blows out all the lamps at once, but when each lamp is turned down just slightly, one after another, until the darkness that was always there at the edges of the room has very quietly moved to the center. From now, though, in the autumn of that year, the three men had what they wanted. Pompey would soon find other gifts to anchor his happiness. A young wife, a new stone theater rising on the Campus Martius, the warm sense that Rome still needed him and still loved him, even if the Senate required careful handling. There were dinner parties to attend, estates to manage, the ordinary pleasures of a man at the height of his fame, who has at last resolved his most pressing frustrations. Those pleasures, and the particular Roman life that surrounded them, the oil lamps lit at dusk, the gardens fragrant with late roses, the sound of water in the courtyard, the companionable weight of a city settling into evening, are what carry us gently into the next stretch of this story, where we linger for a while in the domestic warmth of Pompey's world at its most golden, before the cooling begins. For now, let the fire burn low, and rest. The morning comes slowly to the hills above Rome, the way it always does in the long warm months, seeping first into the eastern sky as a kind of pale suggestion, a softening of the darkness rather than any sudden announcement, the light gathering itself gently over the terracotta rooftops and the distant thread of the Tiber, finding the courtyard fountains and making them gleam, touching the laurel hedges and the clay pots of rosemary and thyme that a servant has already set out along the garden wall before the household has properly stirred. It is some time in the decade that falls between the close of the eastern campaigns and the gathering storms that would eventually unmake the Republic. A decade of relative peace for Rome, a decade in which the city breathes differently, more expansively, as though it too understands that one of its great men has come home and decided, for a while at least, simply to live. Pompey at the height of his fame is a man who fills the city in ways that go beyond the merely political. His name is everywhere, in the conversations of the forum, in the letters that travel between the villas of the wealthy, in the casual remarks of bread sellers and water carriers who know, even without understanding the full architecture of his campaigns, that this is the man who swept the sea clean of pirates in the span of a single season, who marched to the edges of the known world and bent it toward Rome. He carries this fame with a quality that ancient writers found unusual and worth remarking upon, something that reads not as arrogance, but as a kind of settled ease, a man who has absorbed the weight of his own legend so thoroughly that it no longer seems to burden him. He is in his middle 40s now, broad-shouldered still, the particular handsomeness of his youth softened but not erased by the years of sun and wind and campaign. And when he walks through the city, the crowds that gather have about them that quality of warmth rather than mere spectacle, people glad to see him rather than simply awed. His domestic life in these years centers on Mucia, his third wife, with whom he has been joined since before the great eastern campaigns, and from whom the story goes he had grown slowly, irrevocably distant during his long absence in the east. The ancient sources, Plutarch among them, speak of rumors that reached Pompey on campaign, whispers about Mucia's conduct during the years he was away, suggestions of faithlessness that, true or not, had by the time he returned become something he could no longer quietly set aside. And so, not long after his great triumph, he divorced her, a transaction that in the Roman world carried neither the public drama nor the prolonged negotiation that such endings carry in later ages, but which nonetheless rippled outward through the circles of Roman society. Because Mucia was not merely a wife, but a woman of considerable family, connected to men who were among the most powerful in the Senate, and the decision to end the marriage was also in its way a political statement, a reorganization of alliances. What follows with a speed that strikes even some ancient observers as noteworthy is a new marriage. Pompey contracts a union with a young woman named Julia, not the daughter of Julius Caesar, who would later become so important in this story, but a different Julia entirely. And then, in the web of arrangements that characterize this period, the alliance with Caesar brings its own matrimonial dimension, Pompey eventually taking Caesar's daughter, his own Julia, as his wife in a match that is as much political architecture as personal connection. It is this last marriage, the one to Julia, Caesar's daughter, that the ancient sources single out again and again as something genuinely tender. She is considerably younger than Pompey, and by almost every account, the relationship between them is marked by a warmth and affection that goes well beyond the calculated convenience of the arrangement. Plutarch writes of her with something approaching wistfulness, suggesting that she loved Pompey deeply and that he, in turn, was moved by her in ways that his earlier marriages had not quite managed. The story goes that she would sometimes weep with worry when he was away, that he would return to her with an attentiveness that those who observed them found touching. In a world in which marriage among the powerful is almost always also strategy, their apparent happiness together has the quality of something unexpected, a small warmth in the marble corridors of Roman public life. The household that Pompey maintains in these years is generous and well-run, the kind of house in which the morning smells of fresh bread and lamp oil and cut flowers, in which the sound of water moving through the garden channels provides a gentle background note to the business of the day, in which visitors are received with a hospitality that reflects both genuine warmth and the careful performance of status. His gardens are spoken of admiringly. The libraries in his houses, and he maintains several, at his Roman residence and at his various country villas, reflect the education of a man who has traveled the sophisticated East and absorbed something of its intellectual culture, who has met with philosophers and poets, and has come home carrying not only military glory, but a broadened sense of what civilization might look like. He reads, he corresponds. He is not a writer himself in the way that Caesar would become, leaving behind his own polished accounts of his campaigns. but he is genuinely interested in the life of the mind, in the way that the most successful Roman generals of this period often were, understanding that culture and power speak to each other, that the city's memory of greatness is maintained not only in stone and bronze, but in words. And then there's the theater, the great stone theater, the one that transforms the Roman cityscape, and that carries his name down through the centuries, long after most of the details of his campaigns have grown hazy for ordinary people. Before Pompey builds it, Rome has theaters, of course, but they are temporary structures, wooden and seasonal, erected for festivals and then dismantled, because there is among the Roman aristocracy a lingering unease about permanent theaters, a sense inherited from an older and more austere Rome that a building dedicated entirely to entertainment and leisure represents a certain softness, a loosening of civic virtue. Pompey navigates this suspicion with characteristic political cleverness. He builds his theater in the Campus Martius, that broad field to the north of the city proper, that has long been the space for assemblies and military exercises, and the kinds of civic activity that the old Romans had not minded. And at the top of the great curved sweep of seats he places a temple to Venus Victrix, Venus the bringer of victory, so that the whole structure can be described, if anyone wishes to object, as not a theater at all, but a temple approached by a very elaborate set of steps that happen also to function as seating. Whether anyone is seriously deceived by this framing is another matter, but the arrangement gives the necessary cover, and the theater rises. It is enormous by any standard the Roman world has yet applied to such structures, capable of holding, the sources suggest, somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 spectators, the numbers varying wildly in different accounts, as ancient numbers sometimes do. It is built in stone, permanent and self-confident, faced with marble in its most prominent surfaces, decorated with statues and artwork that Pompey has gathered from across his campaigns in the east. 14 statues representing the nations he has conquered, arranged along its colonnades. Attached to it is a great portico, a covered walkway and garden space where Romans can stroll and rest between performances, planted with trees and set with fountains, a space that becomes immediately one of the fashionable gathering places of the city. Next to it he builds a great hall, a curia, that the Senate will use for meetings, and in that hall, some years hence, history will find a use for the space that Pompey himself cannot yet imagine. But for now the theater stands as an expression of what this moment in Pompey's life feels like. Generous, permanent, confident, oriented toward the life of the city, rather than the disruption of it. On evenings when performances are given, the whole quarter fills with a particular quality of sound and movement, the crowd flowing through the gardens as the last light leaves the sky, the lamps being lit one by one along the colonnades, so that the spaces between the columns glow soft and amber, the smell of oil smoke drifting through the plane trees that Pompey has had planted in the covered walks. Voices rise and fall, the warm, buzzing conversation of a city at ease with itself for an evening. Children running between adult legs, the vendors of figs and nuts and hot wine settling into their positions. And over all of it, the sense of something given freely, a public gift, a man at the summit of his reputation choosing to spend some portion of that reputation on something lasting, something for the city to use and enjoy and remember. The water in the garden fountains catches the lamplight and throws it back in small glittering pieces, moving and still at once, the way all good things in this brief golden interval seem to be, suspended for a moment between the past and whatever is coming next, resting in the warmth before the night deepens further. The years of contentment are as long as they are going to be, and there is still time yet to enjoy them. For now, the fountains play, the lamplight holds, and the city rests in the company of its most famous son. There is a particular quality to late afternoon light in Rome during the summer months, a heavy golden stillness that settles over the city like warm cloth laid across a sleeping body, when the shadows stretch long and soft from the columns of the Forum, and the dust of the streets hangs almost motionless in the air, and everything seems, for just a moment, as though it might remain exactly as it is forever. It is the kind of light that invites you to believe in permanence, in the steady continuation of things, in the idea that what has been built and arranged and carefully tended will simply go on being built and arranged and tended, morning after morning, season after season, without end. And perhaps that is why it is the cruelest light of all, because permanence is the one promise that time never keeps, and the things we most wish to hold in our hands are always the first to slip away. The alliance of three men, Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, had been renewed and reaffirmed at the town of Lucca in the 56th year before the birth of Christ, and for a little while longer it held, or seemed to hold, the way a cracked vessel seems whole until you pour water into it and watch the slow seeping begin. The agreements made there were practical and careful, distributing power across the Roman world like a merchant, dividing goods into 3 equal portions. Caesar would keep his command in Gaul and extend it further, reaching north and west into territories that most Romans had never seen and could barely imagine, lands of forest and cold river, where the people painted their skin blue and the winters lasted half the year. Pompey and Crassus would stand together for the consulship, and then each would take a great command of his own, Pompey in Spain, Crassus in Syria, and for a season the arrangement felt solid enough, felt like something that might last. But there was a thread woven through all of it that no one at Lucca had spoken aloud, because to speak it would have been to acknowledge how much everything depended on a single fragile life. That thread was Julia, Pompey's wife and Caesar's daughter, and she was already, the story goes, showing signs of the frailty that would take her from the world not long after. She was young, perhaps still in her middle 20s, and the ancient sources speak of her as genuinely loved, which was not always something one could say of Roman political marriages, where women were moved across the board of public life like pieces in a slow game, their own wishes consulted only when it was convenient. Pompey, it is said, was genuinely fond of her, and she of him, and in the easy warmth of that domestic life, the lamplight of their shared evenings, the sound of her voice somewhere in the house, there was something real, something that softened the harder edges of what Pompey was and what he was becoming. She died in the 54th year before the birth of Christ, in childbirth, and the child did not survive her by long. Rome, by all accounts, mourned her publicly, which was unusual for a woman of her station, and it is said that the people insisted on burying her in the Campus Martius, despite the wishes of those who would have had it otherwise, which tells you something about how thoroughly she had made herself known, how much warmth she had gathered around her, even in that hard, bright city. Pompey had her buried there, by the river, where the light falls on the water in the early morning, and the sounds of the city are still soft and far away. What her death meant for the alliance was not felt all at once. These things rarely announced themselves clearly. It was more like the way a fire begins to die down, not with a sudden going out, but with a gradual dimming, a slow retreat of heat, the coals cooling almost imperceptibly until you look up and realize that the room has grown cold around you while you were not watching. Julia had been, without anyone quite meaning her to be, the living bond between the two most powerful men in the world, the warmth that kept two fires from turning toward each other. And without her, the two men were simply two men, ambitious and watchful, and increasingly aware that the space between them was no longer filled with anything except the old agreements. And old agreements, like old fires, need tending. Crassus, meanwhile, had gone east to Syria with his new command and his old hunger for glory, a hunger that had never quite been satisfied by wealth alone. And in the 53rd year before the birth of Christ, at a place called Carrhae in the dry lands beyond the Euphrates, he met his end in one of the most complete military disasters in the long history of Roman arms. The Parthian cavalry surrounded his legions in the open desert, and the arrows came in such numbers and from such distances that the Romans had no answer for them, no formation that could hold, no ground to retreat to, and what had marched out so confidently into the eastern heat came back in fragments, or did not come back at all. Crassus himself died there, and it is said, though the story may have grown in the telling, that the Parthians poured molten gold into his mouth after his death, a dark joke about a man who had spent his life accumulating wealth beyond counting. With Crassus gone, the arithmetic of the triumvirate collapsed. Three men dividing power between them can always find a balance of sorts, each one watchful of the other two, none able to move against the others without being outweighed. But two men dividing the world between them is a different calculation entirely, because with two men there is no balance, only the slow tilting of the scales, and every gain by one is necessarily a loss for the other. and the distance between them begins to feel less like a shared space and more like a frontier. Caesar was still in Gaul, but the reports that came back from the north told of victories so enormous, so seemingly endless, that they were beginning to take on a different quality in Rome, less like the news of a general doing his job, and more like the emanations of something that had grown very large in a dark place and was beginning to test the walls. He had crossed into the island of Britain, which most Romans had thought of as barely real, a misty rumor at the edge of the world, and he had stood on its shores and looked out at the gray ocean beyond, and when the news of that reached Rome, something shifted in the way people thought about him. Pompey, it is said, received these reports quietly, without visible distress. But those who watched him noticed that he spent more time in those years at his estates outside Rome, walking in the gardens in the late afternoon light, thinking thoughts that he did not share widely. The political atmosphere in Rome itself had been growing stranger and more volatile through these years, full of violence and noise, street gangs and canceled elections, and the kind of low-grade disorder that makes everyone anxious, even when no single event seems catastrophic. A man named Clodius had turned the streets into something like a theater of his own ambitions, and his rival Milo had done the same on the other side, and the city lurched between them in a way that left most ordinary Romans simply wanting someone to make it stop. When Clodius was killed on the Appian Way in the 52nd year before the birth of Christ, killed in a roadside brawl that had gotten out of hand, though the truth of how exactly it happened has always been somewhat unclear, the city responded with a burst of grief and anger so intense that his supporters burned the Senate house itself, and the smoke rose over the city for days, and the smell of it settled into the streets and the cloth of people's clothes, a dark reminder of how close to the edge everything had come. It was in this atmosphere of smoke and unease that the Senate turned to Pompey, asking him to serve as sole consul to restore order, an arrangement without precedent, a thing that had no clean name in Roman tradition, and which both gave him extraordinary power and made it unmistakably clear that the old ways of doing things were no longer adequate to the world Rome had become. He accepted, and he brought order back to the city, and he did it competently, as he did most things, but the very fact of what he had done, the sole consulship, the troops in the streets, the emergency authority, had pushed him into territory from which it was very hard to step back, and the distance between himself and Caesar had become by now something that felt less like a space that could be bridged, and more like a frontier waiting to become a battlefield. And yet for the moment it was still only a feeling, still only the cold draft under the door, the candle flame leaning in the wind, the fire not yet gone, but clearly, unmistakably, burning lower. The city settled into an uneasy quiet as Pompey's soldiers kept the streets, and somewhere to the north, beyond the mountains and the forests, Caesar's army rested in its winter camp, and the fires of that camp burned steady and warm against the dark, throwing their light out into the trees, into the long shadows of the world that was coming. The lamps were burning low across Rome that winter, guttering in the drafts that crept beneath the great doors of the Senate house, casting long, unsteady shadows along the marble floors, where senators wrapped their togas tighter, and spoke in voices barely above a whisper, as though the city itself were listening, and they were not yet certain whose side it would take. It had been building for a long time, this feeling, the way a storm builds somewhere out over the Tyrrhenian Sea, visible on the horizon for days, as a darkening of the air, a heaviness in the light, a stillness among the birds before it finally arrives, and the rain comes down in earnest, and there is nothing left to do but find shelter and wait. Those who had been watching Rome carefully, and there were many who had, senators and merchants and freedmen and priests, all of them had felt this particular storm gathering for years, perhaps since the day Caesar first crossed into Gaul with his legions, and began the long, slow business of making himself indispensable to the city that feared him. Pompey had felt it too. He had lived long enough inside the machinery of Roman power to understand how it worked, how alliances formed and dissolved like weather, how a man's greatness could become overnight the very thing that made him dangerous. He had once been that man himself, young and brilliant and frightening in his capabilities, a general who had swept seas clean and reshaped the Eastern world, and walked through streets where crowds pressed close, just to see his face. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it felt like to be Caesar now, and that understanding did not comfort him. The winter of the year that would come to be counted as the 49th before the birth of Christ settled across Italy with a particular gray quiet, the kind of cold that does not announce itself with drama, but simply settles in, misting the hills, thickening the rivers, laying a pale frost across the pastures of Picenum and Latium and the long flat stretches of the Po Valley to the north. In Rome itself, the days were short and the evenings came early, and by the time the lamps were lit in the great houses on the Palatine and the Esquiline, the city had already drawn inward, the streets emptying, the sounds of daily commerce fading into something quieter and more uncertain. In the Senate House, the debate had been going on for months, the terms shifting and receding like water over shallow stones, never quite resolving, never quite breaking. The central question was this: Caesar's command in Gaul was ending, or would soon be ending, and the question of what came next, whether he would return to Rome as a private citizen stripped of his armies, or whether he would be permitted to stand for the consulship in absentia, maintaining his immunity from prosecution while he made the transition, had become the fulcrum upon which everything balanced. Caesar's enemies in the Senate, and by now there were many, wanted him stripped of his command, brought back to the city as an ordinary man, made to face whatever charges they could assemble against him. Caesar, through his allies and his letters and his extraordinary capacity for political patience, made clear that this would not happen, could not happen, that to lay down his arms before he could be certain of protection was to walk into a trap he had no intention of entering. Pompey stood at the center of all of this and found, perhaps for the first time in his long and distinguished career, that standing at the center was not the same as being in control of it. He had been given a command, a genuine legal authority, the kind that Rome bestowed in moments of perceived emergency, the power to raise troops and defend the Republic against threats both foreign and domestic. The Senate had turned to him because he was still, in the imagination of most Romans, the greatest living general the city possessed, the man who had swept the pirates from the sea in 3 months, the man who had pushed the borders of Roman power to the Caucasus and beyond. His name still carried weight, still caused men to straighten their shoulders and speak with a certain reverence. And yet Pompey knew, with the particular self-awareness that had always lived alongside his ambition, that his position was more complicated than it appeared. He had been ill the previous year, seriously ill, and the cities of Italy had burned incense and offered prayers for his recovery with a warmth that had genuinely moved him, that had made him believe, or want to believe, that the affection of the people was still his, was real, was something he could count on. But affection and military readiness were different things entirely, and when he looked at the legions he actually commanded, when he counted what he truly had available to place against Caesar's battle-hardened veterans, who had spent 9 years fighting Gauls and Germans in the rough, cold forests of the north, he knew the numbers were not comfortable. He had legions, yes, and he had the legal authority and the moral backing of the Senate, and he had his own formidable reputation. But Caesar's men had been with their general for nearly a decade, and armies that had spent years making war together in difficult conditions develop a kind of animal loyalty, a bond forged in shared cold and shared hunger and shared danger that is not easily broken and not easily replicated. It is said that Pompey assured those who worried about Caesar that he had only to stamp his foot upon the ground and legions would spring up fully armed to defend the Republic. And perhaps he did say something like this. Perhaps in a moment of public confidence he reached for the reassurance that was expected of him and offered it, without pausing too long, to examine whether he fully believed it himself. That is what great men are sometimes required to do, to perform certainty for the benefit of those around them, even when certainty is not quite what they feel in the quiet of their own thoughts. And then, in January, the news came from the north. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon. The Rubicon was a small river, unremarkable in almost every way, a thin thread of cold water running down through the foothills of northern Italy to the Adriatic, the kind of river that a man might ford on horseback without getting the lower half of his cloak particularly wet. But it was a legal boundary, the line beyond which a Roman general was forbidden by law to bring his armed forces, the invisible wall that separated the province from the city, the military world from the civilian one, the general. To cross it with an army was not a military act, it was a constitutional one, a statement, a declaration, a choice that could not be uncrossed. Caesar crossed it at night, or so the story goes, in the deep cold hours before dawn, and by morning his forces were moving south through Italy, and the news was spreading faster than cavalry could ride, carried by merchants and runaway slaves, and terrified local magistrates, passed from town to town along the great roads of the peninsula like fire moving through dry grass in August. Rome dissolved. That is perhaps too simple a word for what happened, but it captures something true. The city, which had been holding itself in a state of anxious suspension for months, exhaling slowly and carefully, and never quite committing to belief in the worst possibility, suddenly had no more patience for suspension. Senators fled, some of them without their winter cloaks, without adequate money, without clear plans, simply moving toward the gates and out of the city because the walls no longer felt like protection and the streets no longer felt like home. Wealthy families sent their valuables south or into the countryside or onto ships, the temples filled with people making offerings, asking for signs, standing very still in the lamplight and looking at the faces of the old gods for any indication of what came next. Pompey left Rome. He moved south toward Brundisium on the heel of Italy toward the sea, taking with him what troops he had, and the remnant of the Senate that would follow, and the weight of a commission that had arrived, perhaps a little too late, and with a little too little behind it to be the salvation anyone had hoped for. The roads of Italy were cold beneath his horse's hooves that January, the olive trees bare and silver in the winter light, the fields empty, the farmhouses shuttered, the whole long spine of the peninsula lying quiet under a sky the color of pale stone. He rode south, and the lamps of the villages he passed through glowed faintly in the early dark, small warm points of light, in an Italy that felt suddenly very large and very uncertain, each flame a household holding its breath, waiting to learn whose world it was going to be living in when spring finally came and the roads dried out and the armies began to move in earnest. He rode south, and behind him the great city that had made him and shaped him and celebrated him continued its anxious vigil beneath the winter stars, its own 1,000 lamps burning through the long cold night, casting their familiar unsteady glow across stone and shadow and the slow turning of a world at the edge of something it could not quite yet name. The fires had been burning for months. Across the length of Greece and the broken coastlines of the Adriatic, wherever Pompey's army made its camp, the soldiers fed their flames through the long nights with whatever wood the land could offer. Olive branches, fence posts, the splintered timber of wagons that had carried too much for too long. And in the warmth of those fires, in the amber light that pooled between the tents and touched the faces of men who had marched from Italy and Spain and Syria and the far provinces of the east, there was still something that resembled confidence, or at least the memory of it. Pompey had gathered an enormous force, by most accounts, by the careful tallying of the ancient writers who tried afterward to make sense of what had happened. His legions at Pharsalus numbered somewhere near 50,000 foot soldiers, with cavalry perhaps 5 times as numerous as Caesar's own. He had the Senate with him, or what remained of it, those proud and fractious men who had fled Rome in the winter's chaos and now sat in camp like exiled kings, issuing opinions and demanding haste. He had provisions enough, and ships, and the blessing of a cause that called itself legitimate, and yet, something in the long months of retreat had left a shadow on everything, a heaviness that the fires could warm but not quite lift. The retreat itself had been a strange season. After the crossing of the Adriatic, after Brundisium and the narrow escape from Caesar's incomplete blockade, Pompey had led his forces into the Balkans with what looked, from a certain angle, like strategic patience. He did not want a pitched battle. He had said so plainly, to anyone who would listen, and to many who would not. His plan, it is said, was the long game, to starve Caesar of supplies, to wear his legions thin with marching, to let the vast resources of the eastern provinces and the loyalty of allied kings press slowly inward, until Caesar's position became tenable. It was not a foolish plan. It was in many ways the sensible plan of a man who had spent his life learning that war rewarded patience as often as it rewarded boldness. At Dyrrhachium, on the rocky Illyrian coast, Pompey had very nearly proved the point. Caesar's forces had built a great arc of fortifications, attempting to hem Pompey's army against the sea, and for weeks the two armies had watched each other across those earthworks, hungry and tired and waiting. Then Pompey had found a weakness, struck it, and sent Caesar's men reeling in one of the few genuine defeats Caesar ever suffered in the field. The fires in Pompey's camp that night had burned very brightly indeed. But Caesar did not dissolve. He retreated into Thessaly, reorganized and waited with that unsettling patience of his own, the patience of a man who believed, somewhere beneath conscious thought, that the world was arranging itself in his favor. And the Senate, those exiled grandees warming themselves around Pompey's fires and dreaming of their houses and their dignity, grew louder and more insistent. They were tired of the long game. They could see Caesar's legions dwindling in the Thessalian heat, short of grain, far from home. Finish it now, they said. Give us the battle. Give us Rome back. Pompey listened, which was perhaps where the long, slow undoing truly began. He was a general of extraordinary experience and genuine gifts, but he had always existed in a peculiar relationship with the approval of powerful men, needing it even as he chafed against it. And the pressure from the Senate and from officers like Domitius Ahenobarbus and Metellus Scipio became, over those warm summer weeks of 68 years before the birth of Christ, something he could no longer hold entirely at bay. And so he moved south and east into Thessaly, and Caesar moved to meet him. And on the 6th day of what we now call August, the two armies looked at each other across the plain near the river Enipeus, not far from the old town of Pharsalus, in the dry and yellowed landscape of a Greek summer at its height. The plain was flat enough, open enough, the kind of ground where numbers ought to have told. The fires the soldiers had built the night before had died down to coals by the time the lines were dressed and the standards raised and the waiting began, that particular awful waiting of the ancient battlefield, standing in formation under the climbing sun while the officers moved behind the ranks and the trumpeters held their breath. Pompey's plan for the cavalry was ambitious, and it must be said, not unreasonable on its face. His horsemen on the left wing, so numerous they might have seemed a second army in themselves, were to sweep around Caesar's right flank, roll up his line from behind, and end the battle before the infantry engagement had truly settled. Caesar, who had almost certainly anticipated this, placed his best and most experienced cohorts at an angle behind his own cavalry, veterans who had been told not to use their javelins as javelins at all, but to thrust them upward at the faces of the horses, at the eyes of the riders, to make the fight ugly and close and frightening rather than a clean cavalry charge. The story goes that Caesar's veterans had been told simply to aim for the faces, and when Pompey's horsemen came, magnificent and numerous, and fully expecting to roll through whatever thin screen stood before them, they met instead this strange and brutal wall of upward-thrusting iron, and they faltered, and they broke, and they rode from the field in a way that once begun could not be stopped. After that, the afternoon came apart quickly, though the ancient writers linger on it at length, trying to capture the precise sequence of the unraveling. Pompey's left wing, suddenly exposed, began to collapse. Caesar's cohorts wheeled and pressed. The legions in the center, fighting their opposite numbers with the slow, grinding discipline of Roman close-quarter battle, felt the change in pressure, the way a battle has its own atmosphere and communicates its shifts through something other than visible signal. And the morale that had sustained them through the months of waiting began to fail. Men began to leave the line, first singly, and then in groups, moving back toward the camp, and then beyond the camp, toward the hills. Pompey himself, it is said, watched the cavalry break from his position at the left wing, and seemed for a long moment simply not to understand what he was seeing. The sources are gentle with him here, or perhaps simply uncertain, and one senses in their words the difficulty of explaining what happens inside a man of immense ability and long success in the moment when the thing he has built and commanded and staked everything upon simply ceases to obey the logic he has always known. He rode back to camp. He sat for a time. Then he rode on and kept riding north and east, away from Pharsalus, away from the legions who were now surrendering by the thousands on the plain behind him. Caesar's numbers for the aftermath suggest something approaching 45,000 of Pompey's soldiers were captured or surrendered, with perhaps 6,000 dead on the field itself. The Senate men who had been so urgent for the battle scattered to the winds of the eastern Mediterranean, some to seek terms, some to carry the war on in Africa and Spain. The camp, when Caesar's men entered it, still held the decorated tents the senatorial officers had pitched in the conviction that tonight would be their triumphant celebration. Garlands already cut, dining couches already arranged, wine already chosen. Caesar is said to have walked through it in silence. But Pharsalus was not quite the end of anything, not yet. The Republic did not cease to exist on that dry August afternoon, though the wound was mortal. Men and ideas take longer to die than a single afternoon allows, and Pompey himself was still riding east, toward the coast, toward a ship, toward whatever the world that remained might still offer to a man who had once been called the greatest Roman of his age. The fires along the shore that night would have been small, carefully made, the fires of men who did not wish to be seen. And somewhere in their modest light, Pompey was thinking, as he had always thought, about what came next. The sea was still before him. There were still kings in the east who remembered his name with something like reverence, and there was still perhaps a path through all of this towards something that had not yet been fully lost. He sailed southeast, and the next chapter of his story belongs to a different shore, a different sky, and a very different kind of ending than anyone who had known him in the fullness of his greatness could quite have imagined possible. The sea that morning was the color of old bronze, flat and still in the way that only Mediterranean waters become in the deep heat of late summer, when the winds have forgotten their purpose, and the surface holds the sky like a mirror too tired to give back a perfect reflection. Pompey's ship moved through it slowly, and he stood at the stern, or so the story goes, wrapped in his traveling cloak, watching the coastline of Egypt materialize from the haze as a low, dark line, barely distinguishable at first from the horizon itself, growing only gradually into something solid, something real, something that might yet offer safety. He had been at sea for many days by then, since the catastrophe at Pharsalus, since the long stunned hours of riding and then sailing and then riding again. The world had taken on a quality of unreality, the way fever does, or grief that has not yet found its proper shape. He had sailed first to Mytilene, where his wife Cornelia was waiting. Cornelia, who had not been at the battle, who heard the news of it from the expression on his face before he had spoken a single word. She had cried out, the sources tell us, and blamed herself, as people in profound shock sometimes do, reaching for any explanation that might make loss feel less arbitrary. Pompey had comforted her as gently as he could, and together they had moved on, stopping here and there along the coasts of Asia Minor, testing the loyalties of cities, finding friends grown cautious, governors grown suddenly vague about their allegiances, the whole eastern Mediterranean quietly rearranging itself around the new shape of power. Egypt had seemed, in the end, the most plausible destination. It was outside Caesar's immediate reach. It was wealthy. Its young king, Ptolemy the 13th, a boy of perhaps 13 or 14 years, ruling alongside his sister Cleopatra in an arrangement that was already growing strained and dangerous, owed a certain debt, at least in memory, to Rome, and specifically to Pompey, who had long been patron of the Ptolemaic court in the easy way that powerful Roman generals accumulated Eastern obligations. There was a letter of introduction, or something understood to serve that purpose. There was hope, which is to say there was very little, dressed carefully in the clothes of reason. The ship anchored at some distance from the shore near Pelusium, which lay at the eastern mouth of the Nile Delta, a flat and sandy place where the land seems undecided about whether it wishes to be water or earth, where the reed beds whisper, even when there is no wind, and the light comes down through the haze as something diffuse and golden and slightly unreal. The young king's court was encamped nearby. There was a war, or the beginning of one, between Ptolemy and his sister, and the armies had gathered at this edge of Egypt to settle the question. It is said that Ptolemy's advisors debated at length what to do about the famous Roman who had arrived uninvited in his defeat. Welcoming him fully might antagonize Caesar, who was by now clearly winning everything. Turning him away might seem an unnecessary insult to a man who had not yet been formally destroyed. The advisors chose a third path, the kind of path that men choose when they lack the courage for either honesty or mercy, and it has been remembered ever since as one of the ugliest calculations of that already ugly era. A small boat was sent out from the shore. It carried 3 men, a Roman officer named Lucius Septimius, who had once served under Pompey himself in the old pirate wars, a detail the ancient sources emphasize with a kind of quiet horror, and 2 others, an Egyptian named Achilles, one of the king's generals, and a third whose name history has let go. They came alongside Pompey's ship and invited him to step into the smaller vessel, explaining, politely, that the shallows near the shore would not permit a larger vessel to approach. The explanation was plausible. The shallows at the Nile's mouths are real, the sandbanks genuine, the invitation reasonable on its surface. Cornelia watched from the deck of the larger ship. Pompey's friends and officers watched. There is a moment described in the ancient accounts, particularly in Plutarch, who shapes it with great care, in which Pompey looked back at those watching faces on the ship and recited, quietly, 2 lines from Sophocles in Greek, about the man who comes as a suppliant to a tyrant's door and becomes thereby a slave. He said these words softly, almost to himself, as a man might murmur a familiar prayer, not because it will change anything, but because the words themselves are a form of company. Then he gave his hand to one of the men in the small boat and stepped down into it. The boat was quiet. It moved toward shore. Septimius, standing behind Pompey, drew his sword, and here the narration must slow, because the ancient writers slow here too, because something in the human record resists moving quickly through this moment. Pompey, it is said, drew his cloak up over his face with both hands when he understood what was happening, and did not struggle, and did not cry out. He died in this posture of composed resignation, in the bottom of a small wooden boat, on a flat and glittering sea, within sight of the Egyptian shore. He was 57 years old. It was, by the old Roman counting, the 28th day of September, in the year that we would call 48 before the birth of Christ. By a dark coincidence that the Romans noted afterward with a kind of cold wonder, it was also the day before his birthday. His head was taken and preserved. His body was thrown into the water. A freedman named Philippus, who had been with Pompey for many years, retrieved what remained from the surf and buried it in the sand, simply with what he had. He gathered driftwood from the beach. He used his own clothing to wrap what was left of the body, moving carefully and quietly, in the way of people who are performing a necessary and private act of love, not for an audience, not for history, but because it is the right thing and there is no one else to do it. A small fire, the sources tell us, the smoke rising straight up into the still Egyptian air, because there was no wind. The reed beds at the edge of the water, making their soft, continuous sound. The sea doing what the sea always does, indifferent and immense and gently bright. Cornelia, still on the ship, saw the smoke. She understood. They carried the grief north and west and eventually back toward Rome, though Rome itself would take a long time to fully comprehend what it had lost, or what it had allowed to happen, which is a different kind of loss, the kind that settles into a civilization's understanding of itself only slowly, over years and generations. Caesar, when he arrived in Egypt shortly afterward and was presented with Pompey's head as a gift, is said to have wept. Whether the tears were genuine, whether they were politic, whether they were simply the involuntary response of a complicated man confronted with the end of someone who had been, at various times, his ally, his rival, his family, and his enemy, Caesar turned away from the head and wept, and ordered that Pompey's remains be treated with honor. And it is said that he kept the signet ring, the ring engraved with a lion holding a sword, for some time afterward, though what he felt when he looked at it only Caesar knew. The beach at Pelusium is gone now, swallowed by time and the slow rearrangements of the delta, and the reed beds have shifted, and the old coastlines are buried under sand and centuries, but the quality of that light is still there, the same diffuse golden haze that settles over the Egyptian shore in the late months of summer, the same stillness of a sea that has forgotten its own restlessness, the same thin line where water becomes land, becomes sky. The smoke of Philippus's small fire has long since scattered into nothing, but it rose once, straight and true, in a place where there was no wind, and someone who loved Pompey watched it rise and wept, and the sea held its own vast silence around the moment as it always does, neither kind nor cruel, simply present. Tonight, resting here in the quiet, you might let that image settle softly into sleep. The calm water, the thin thread of smoke, the boundless eastern sky. Tomorrow there will be more to say about who Pompey was across the long span of his life, about what he left in the world, about how those who came after slowly gathered his memory and made something careful and lasting from it. But that is a gentle story for another night, and it will keep. For now, let the water be still, and let the shore be far away, and let yourself drift slowly into the deep, unhurried dark of rest. The water is still now. After everything, after the dusty roads of Picenum, the smoke of 100 campaign fires, the salt wind off the Mediterranean, and the strange perfumed air of eastern cities, after the roar of 3 triumphs and the long silences of political exile, after the reed marshes of Egypt and the quiet horror of a small boat moving away from shore, the water is still now, and we can rest a little while in what remains. What remains, when a life as large as Pompey's finally closes, is not always what the man himself imagined it would be. He had built a theater of stone, the first permanent theater Rome had ever known, and he had imagined, perhaps, that stone endures. He had reorganized the Eastern world and planted Roman law in places where it had never reached before, and he had imagined, perhaps, that order endures. He had been loved by soldiers and by the people of Rome in ways that few men in any century are loved, and surely some part of him believed that love endures. And in their slow, imperfect human way, all of these things did endure, only not quite in the shapes he would have chosen, and not always carrying his name as clearly as he might have wished. The ancient writers who came after him struggled, in their gentle and sometimes contradictory ways, to say who Pompey truly was. Plutarch, writing more than a century after his death, approached him with a kind of wistful admiration, the way one might approach a very old painting whose colors have softened, but whose composition still commands the room. He saw in Pompey a man of genuine nobility, not the cold marble nobility of a senator who had inherited his dignity, but something warmer and more personal, a quality of presence that made ordinary people feel, when Pompey looked at them, that they had been truly seen. Plutarch noted how the soldiers loved him, not with the frantic devotion that Caesar's men would later show, but with something steadier, more domestic almost, the affection of men who trusted that their general knew their names and would not spend their lives carelessly. It is said that Pompey learned the names of an extraordinary number of his men, that he walked through camps in the evening and greeted veterans by name years after campaigns had ended, and that this small human practice bound legions to him more firmly than any victory speech could have done. And yet Plutarch also saw the other Pompey, the man who could be strangely passive at the moments when action was most needed, who seemed at times to wait for Rome to come to him, rather than reaching out to shape events, who found the machinery of politics confusing and slightly beneath him in a way that made him vulnerable to men like Caesar, who had no such confusion and no such pride. There is a portrait in Plutarch that stays with you, of Pompey in those final years before Pharsalus, moving through rooms full of senators who flattered him, while privately doubting him, accepting a command he did not fully want, in a war he was not certain he could win, carried forward more by the momentum of his own reputation than by any clear and burning conviction. It is not an unkind portrait. It is, if anything, a very human one, the portrait of a man who had been exceptional for so long that he had perhaps forgotten how to be merely competent, and who found in the end that exceptional and competent are not always the same thing. Cicero, who knew Pompey personally and wrote about him in letters that still survive across 2,000 years, had a more complicated and more anxious relationship with his memory. He had admired Pompey enormously, had hoped that Pompey would be the man to save the Republic from the forces pulling it apart, and had been repeatedly disappointed by Pompey's inability or unwillingness to play the role that Cicero had written for him in his own imagination. And yet, even in his disappointment, Cicero could not quite let go of his admiration. The letters are full of a kind of grieving fondness, the feeling of a man who has argued with a friend he loves, and then lost that friend before the argument could be resolved. When the news reached Cicero that Pompey had died on the shore at Pelusium, The old orator's response was, by all accounts, one of the more private and genuinely sorrowful moments of his public life. Whatever their disagreements, whatever the failures and the miscalculations, something real had ended, and Cicero knew it. What Pompey left in the physical world was, by any measure, extraordinary. The theater that bore his name stood in Rome for centuries, long after the republic that built it had been transformed beyond recognition into something Pompey would not have understood or perhaps entirely approved of. It is said that Julius Caesar, who understood the power of spectacle as well as any man alive, was struck down in a meeting held in the portico attached to Pompey's theater, a detail that history arranged with the dark symmetry of a dream. The theater itself hosted festivals and performances and political gatherings long into the imperial age, its great curved form settling slowly into the fabric of the city the way very old buildings do, becoming less a monument to a particular man and more simply a part of the landscape. The way mountains become part of a landscape, present, unargued, immovable. Traces of its foundations still lie beneath the streets of modern Rome, patient and unhurried beneath centuries of everything that came after. In the east, the shape of the world that Pompey made persisted for generations. The provinces he organized, the client kingdoms he arranged, the cities he founded or refounded. These were the skeleton of Roman power in the eastern Mediterranean for a very long time. The quiet infrastructure beneath all the drama and violence of the imperial centuries that followed. Pompey moved through the east like a man drawing lines on a map, and many of those lines held. The story goes that certain cities in the region kept his name in one form or another for generations, a small verbal monument to the man who had reorganized their world and then departed toward his own destruction. These are the monuments that most men never build, not arches or columns or theaters, but the simple, durable fact of boundaries that held, roads that were used, arrangements that lasted because they were sensible and because no one who came after saw any reason to change them. And then there is the stranger, softer monument of what Pompey meant to the Romans who came after him, not as a political fact or a military achievement, but as a kind of dream of what the Republic had once been capable of producing. As the empire settled into its long centuries of emperors and dynasties, and the slow forgetting of what republican governance had felt like, Pompey became, in memory, something almost elegiac, a figure from a more complicated and in some ways more vital time, when the game was still open, when the outcome was not predetermined, when a man from the provinces could raise 3 legions from his own estates as a young man barely old enough to shave, and set himself against the current of history. He was not, in memory, a saint. The ancient writers remembered the nickname, the young butcher, and they remembered the ruthlessness in Sicily and Africa, and they did not pretend it away. But they also remembered the quality of his presence, the warmth that Plutarch described, the loyalty of his soldiers, the genuine love of the Roman people that had greeted his 3 triumphs and carried him through decades of public life. There is something in Pompey's story that has spoken quietly to people across a very long time. The story of a man who was genuinely great and genuinely flawed, who built real and lasting things and also made ruinous mistakes, who was loved and then found himself on the wrong side of events too large for any single man to master, who died with a kind of dignity that his enemies, to their credit, acknowledged. Caesar wept, the story goes, when he was shown Pompey's head. Or perhaps he wept because it was politic to weep. Or perhaps he wept because Pompey had been the measure of his own ambition for so long that losing him was like losing the mirror in which he had seen himself most clearly. We cannot know. The water of time has moved over all of it, and what remains is the story, incomplete, occasionally contradictory, occasionally moved by the same breezes that moved through all the places we have visited together across these long, slow evenings. And so we set it down here, gently, the way you set down a lamp when the night has grown late and the room is warm and there is nothing left to do but rest. The lamp that Pompey carried, the lamp of his ambition and his loyalty and his extraordinary talent and his equally extraordinary blindness, has passed into the hands of history, and history has held it carefully, even tenderly, letting the light move across his face one last time, before the dark comes quietly in. He was a man of his world, shaped by everything his world gave him, and broken in the end by the very forces he had helped to set in motion. He was Pompey the Great, and he was also, underneath all the marble and the laurel and the noise of 30 years of triumph, simply a man, tired, sometimes uncertain, carrying more than any one person ought to carry, moving as all of us move through the one life he was given, toward the shore where all of us eventually arrive. Let the water be still now. Let the fires of all those old camps burn low, and the Mediterranean lie quiet in the dark, and the great stone theater settle into its centuries of silence. You have traveled far tonight, through a world both strange and recognizable, and you have earned your rest. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are. We will be here again tomorrow night, holding another lamp, waiting for you.